What if the most powerful alien race isn't arriving in the future, but has already been here for thousands of years? According to one of the most controversial theories in UFO lore, the Alpha-Draconians are ancient reptilian beings said to possess advanced technology, immense intelligence, and a hidden agenda involving humanity itself. From ancient myths and mysterious symbols to alleged eyewitness encounters and modern conspiracy theories, countless stories point to the same chilling possibility. But is there any truth behind these claims, or are they simply one of the greatest myths ever created? In this video, we examine the top 10 alleged proofs of Alpha-Draconian aliens among us and explore why this mysterious race continues to captivate millions around the world. There is a pattern buried in the oldest stories human beings have ever told, and once it is pointed out, it is almost impossible to stop seeing it. Long before airplanes, before ships that could cross oceans, before any culture on Earth knew another culture existed on the far side of the planet, dozens of civilizations that never met, never traded, and never shared a written language all described the same thing. Not a similar thing, not a loosely related myth shaped by common human fears of snakes in the grass. The same thing, an advanced, intelligent, reptilian being, sometimes benevolent, sometimes monstrous, always described as older than mankind, always tied to the sky, and always positioned as either the creator of the human race or the ruler over it. This is the foundation of the entire Alpha-Draconian theory, and it is where any honest investigation has to begin, because the first proof is not a blurry photograph or a deathbed confession. It is a 5,000-year-old paper trail written in clay, stone, and gold, scattered across every continent on Earth, all pointing at the same conclusion. Start in Mesopotamia, in the region modern maps label Iraq, where the oldest surviving writing system on the planet was carved into wet clay tablets by the Sumerians roughly 5,000 years ago. Buried within thousands of these tablets is a recurring set of characters known as the Anunnaki, a name that translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came. The Sumerians did not describe the Anunnaki as gods in the abstract, poetic sense that later religions would adopt. They described them with startling technical specificity, beings who arrived from the sky, who possessed knowledge of genetics, metallurgy, and agriculture far beyond what the Sumerians themselves had, and who were frequently depicted in cylinder seals and reliefs, with elongated skulls, scaled skin, and serpentine features. The researcher Zecharia Sitchin spent decades translating these tablets and proposed that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial visitors from a world he called Nibiru, a claim that remains fiercely contested among mainstream Assyriologists who argue Sitchin's translations stretch the literal meaning of the cuneiform far beyond what the language supports. But strip away Sitchin's specific planetary claims and something else remains undeniable: the imagery carved into the stone itself. Sumerian and later Babylonian artifacts repeatedly show figures with serpent heads standing upright on human bodies, engaged in what appear to be acts of teaching, ruling, or genetic modification of kneeling human figures below them. One of the most cited of these is a seal showing two serpent-headed beings flanking a tree, a scene many researchers have connected directly to the later Genesis account of a serpent in a garden offering forbidden knowledge. The correlation is not subtle, and it is not something later cultures could have simply copied from each other by coincidence, because the geographic and temporal gaps between these civilizations were enormous. The Sumerian material goes further than simple imagery, and this is the part most casual summaries of the Anunnaki leave out. Later Babylonian texts built on the Sumerian foundation, particularly the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish, described the Anunnaki not merely observing early humanity, but deliberately engineering it, mixing the blood or essence of one of their own kind with the clay of the earth to produce a laboring workforce suited to agricultural and mining work. The texts are explicit that this creation was a technical process performed by a specific faction of the Anunnaki for a specific purpose, not a spontaneous act of divine will. Sitchin's critics are correct. that the tablets never use a modern vocabulary of chromosomes or DNA, because no such vocabulary existed in the 3rd millennium BCE, but proponents of the Alpha-Draconian theory argue that judging a 5,000-year-old account by whether it uses 20th century scientific terminology misses the point entirely. The question is whether the underlying description, a directed biological modification of an existing species by a technologically superior outside party for a specific labor purpose, matches what a Bronze Age scribe would have been capable of inventing on his own, or whether it reads instead like a folk memory of an event the scribe did not fully understand but was doing his best to record faithfully. The reliefs recovered from Nimrud and other Assyrian sites reinforce this reading, showing winged, serpent-headed figures standing directly over kneeling human figures in poses that resemble tending, marking, or operating on the humans below, rather than simple worship scenes. Whatever conclusion one draws from it, the through line is consistent. The oldest written civilization on Earth left behind a detailed, repeated account of reptilian beings from the sky who created or modified the human species for their own purposes, a claim that modern Alpha-Draconian researchers argue is not a myth about the origin of humanity in the abstract, but a literal historical record of the moment their species first entered ours. Move west into Egypt, a civilization that rose independently of Sumer, even though the two were geographically closer than most ancient cultures. Egyptian religious iconography is soaked in serpent symbolism at the highest levels of political and spiritual power. The uraeus, the rearing cobra affixed to the crown of every pharaoh, was not decorative. It was believed to be a literal source of divine authority, a physical marker that the pharaoh carried the protection and bloodline of the serpent goddess Wadjet. Egyptian temples at Kom Ombo were built in direct dedication to Sobek, a crocodile-headed deity associated with fertility, military power, and the Nile itself, worshipped with such seriousness that priests kept live sacred crocodiles in temple pools and mummified thousands of them for burial. The Egyptian creation texts describe a primordial serpent named Apep, or Apophis, an entity of near-infinite size existing in the chaos before creation, constantly at war with the sun god Ra. What is notable is not that Egypt had a snake in its mythology. Nearly every culture with snakes in its environment develops some snake folklore. What is notable is the specificity: serpent beings as the literal source of royal authority, serpent beings as pre-human, serpent beings as keepers of forbidden or dangerous knowledge, serpent beings as adversaries powerful enough to threaten the sun itself. This is not simple animal fear. This is a structured, detailed mythology of an intelligent reptilian hierarchy that predates and oversees humanity, and it shows up again with almost the same details on the other side of the world. In China, the dragon was never a monster to be slain. It was the literal symbol of imperial legitimacy. Chinese emperors did not merely use the dragon as a mascot, they claimed direct descent from dragons, wore robes embroidered with 5-clawed dragons reserved exclusively for the throne, and sat upon what was formerly called the Dragon Throne. The mandate to rule China was tied, in official state mythology, to a bloodline connection to draconic beings who were understood to be older than the Chinese people themselves, wiser, and responsible for teaching early humans agriculture, medicine, and the principles of civilization. Early Chinese mythological figures, such as Fuxi and Nuwa, credited with creating and civilizing humanity, are depicted in ancient reliefs not as ordinary humans, but as beings with serpentine or dragon-like lower bodies, human torsos, and intertwined serpent tails. An image strikingly similar to depictions of hybrid serpent-human deities found in completely unconnected Mesoamerican art, thousands of miles away and centuries apart. Chinese dragons were also explicitly associated with control over rain, rivers, and the sky, positioning them, like the Sumerian Anunnaki, as beings who governed the natural forces that human survival depended on. A civilization that had no ships capable of ocean crossing, no contact with Sumer, no shared alphabet, and no shared trade route arrived independently at the idea of a serpentine, sky and water controlling, ancient, superior race that gave humanity the tools of civilization and to whom its rulers owed their bloodline. Cross into India, and the pattern holds again, this time under the name Naga. In Hindu and Buddhist mythology, the Nagas are described as an entire race of serpent beings, distinct from humans, possessing their own cities, hierarchies, and kingdoms, often located underground or beneath bodies of water. They are shown in temple carvings and epic literature such as the Mahabharata as half-human, half-serpent in form, capable of taking fully human shape at will when they choose to interact with mankind. This detail deserves particular attention because the ability to shift between a serpentine true form and a convincing human appearance is one of the most consistent and specific claims made about the Nagas across thousands of years of Indian religious text, and it is precisely the same capability modern Alpha-Draconian researchers attribute to the beings they believe still move among us today. The Nagas were not depicted as universally evil. Some protected sacred sites and Buddhist relics. Others were dangerous and territorial. But every account agrees on the core structure: an ancient serpent race, older than humanity, capable of passing as human and organized into its own civilization, operating in parallel with our own, largely hidden from ordinary human awareness. Hindu cosmology is remarkably specific about where this parallel civilization is said to exist, describing an entire subterranean realm called Patala, situated beneath the surface world, ruled by Naga kings such as Vasuki and Shesha, described as containing cities of extraordinary wealth, jeweled palaces, and populations that vastly outnumber the visible Naga encountered by humans on the surface. This detail, a hidden underground civilization existing in parallel with the surface world and only occasionally surfacing to interact with humanity, recurs independently in Native American tradition as well. Cherokee legend describes the Uktena, a massive horned serpent said to possess a crystal of immense power embedded in its forehead, dangerous to look upon directly, dwelling in deep pools and mountain caves rather than in the open, encountered only by the most spiritually prepared individuals within the tribe. Farther north, Mississippian and Alini oral traditions describe the Piasa, a winged, scaled, serpent-tailed creature painted onto bluffs above the Mississippi River by indigenous artists centuries before European contact, a creature described as having once terrorized the region until it was driven off or destroyed, leaving behind only the painted record and the oral memory of what it had been. Travel to Mesoamerica, separated from Asia and Africa by 2 oceans, populated by civilizations with zero verified contact with the Old World before Columbus, and the same figure appears again under the name Quetzalcoatl to the Aztec and Kukulkan to the Maya, the feathered serpent. Quetzalcoatl was described as a bringer of civilization, credited with gifting humanity the knowledge of writing, the calendar, and agriculture, exactly mirroring the civilizing teacher role assigned to the Sumerian Anunnaki and the Chinese dragon ancestors on the opposite side of the planet. At Chichen Itza, the pyramid known as El Castillo was engineered with such precision that during the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun casts a shadow along the staircase that appears to animate a carved serpent head at the base of the pyramid into a slithering body of light, an effect so deliberate it could only have been the result of advanced astronomical calculation built directly into the architecture. Maya and Aztec priesthoods maintained that this feathered serpent being would one day return, a prophecy that took on enormous historical weight when Spanish conquistadors arrived by sea in a manner some Aztec accounts describe as having been initially interpreted through the lens of that returning god mythology. Whether or not that specific historical interpretation is accurate is debated among historians, but the underlying architecture of the belief is not in question. An ancient serpent being, a civilizing teacher, tied to the sky, expected to return. East Asia contributes its own variant beyond the Chinese imperial dragon. Japanese mythology describes Yamata no Orochi, an 8-headed, 8-tailed serpent of enormous size, so large that entire forests and mountains were said to grow across its back, ultimately defeated by the storm god, Susanoo, who discovers a legendary sword hidden inside one of its tails, a detail that has led some researchers to argue the story encodes a memory of a technologically superior entity possessing objects of value that ordinary humans could not have produced themselves. Farther south, Philippine mythology across multiple indigenous groups describes Bakunawa, a gigantic serpent or dragon said to live in the sea or beneath the earth, and to be responsible for solar and lunar eclipses by devouring the moon, a myth so persistent that ritual noise-making to frighten Bakunawa away during eclipses was practiced in parts of the Philippines well into relatively recent history. Slavic tradition offers Zmej Gorenik, a multi-headed, fire-breathing serpent dragon depicted in Russian and Ukrainian folklore as both a fearsome adversary and, in some regional variants, a being capable of transforming into a handsome human man in order to move undetected among people. A shape-shifting detail that again places human passing ability at the center of a serpent-being tradition with no connection to the Indian, Chinese, or African accounts that describe the same specific trait. In southern Africa, the Zulu shaman and self-described Sanusi Credo Mutwa, who lived until 2020 and spoke publicly about these traditions for decades, described an entity in Zulu oral tradition called the Chitauri, translated by Mutwa as the children of the serpent or the princes of the serpent. Mutwa's public accounts, delivered in recorded interviews before his death, describe the Chitauri as a non-human race that Zulu tradition holds arrived from the sky in the deep past, subjugated early humanity, and continues to exert hidden influence over human affairs to this day. Mutwa went further than most oral traditionalists, publicly stating in filmed interviews that he had been taken to see one of these beings directly as part of his shamanic initiation, and describing it, in his own words, as a towering scaled figure with reptilian features and a cold, calculating presence utterly unlike anything human. Mutwa also produced sculptures throughout his life depicting these entities, static physical artifacts, viewable and photographed, that show elongated humanoid figures with reptilian skin textures and non-human facial structures, created by a man with no connection to Western UFO literature, working from an oral tradition passed to him by Zulu elders who themselves inherited it from generations before them. Mutwa's recorded interviews, most notably the extended filmed conversation released as Reptilian Agenda, describe these encounters in granular physical terms rather than vague spiritual metaphor. Cold skin, a smell he compared to reptile enclosures, an unblinking gaze, and what he described as an overwhelming sense of ancient, patient hostility toward the human species, which he said the Chitauri regard as a resource to be managed rather than a people to be respected. Mutwa also connected the Chitauri tradition directly to well-documented southern African rock art sites, arguing that certain elongated, non-human figures painted by San and Khoikhoi peoples thousands of years before his own lifetime depicted the same beings his own oral tradition warned him about, which, if accurate, would place physical, datable artistic evidence behind an oral account rather than leaving it as testimony alone. On the other side of the world again, in Australia, Aboriginal traditions that stretch back tens of thousands of years, among the oldest continuously practiced belief systems on Earth, describe the rainbow serpent, a foundational creation being credited across numerous Aboriginal nations with carving the rivers, mountains, and waterholes of the continent during the Dreamtime, the primordial era before human history. The rainbow serpent is treated with the deepest reverence in Aboriginal spiritual life, understood not as myth in the dismissive Western sense, but as living sacred truth, and it is described in terms that again emphasize enormous size, connection to water and sky, and a role as literal creator and shaper of the physical world inhabited by humans. Aboriginal Australia had no contact whatsoever with Sumer, Egypt, China, India, or Mesoamerica for the entire span of these traditions, and yet the core structural elements recur. A serpent being of immense scale and age, tied to creation, tied to water, positioned above and prior to humanity. Europe carries its own version, though shaped over time into something more adversarial. Norse mythology describes Jörmungandr, a serpent so vast it encircles the entire world beneath the ocean, destined to rise and battle the god Thor at the end of days. Christian and pre-Christian European folklore is dense with dragon-slaying narratives. St. George, Beowulf's final battle with the dragon guarding its hoard, and countless regional variants, all built around the same premise: an ancient, immensely powerful serpentine being, predating human civilization, holding treasure or knowledge or territory that must be won or defended through confrontation. Researchers who study this pattern point out that a slaying myth is not the same as an origin myth, but it still requires the same starting ingredient found everywhere else on this list: an ancient, intelligent, or at minimum immensely powerful serpent entity that human beings across an entire continent felt compelled to write stories about, generation after generation, for well over 1,000 years. Laid side by side, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss as simple coincidence. Sumer, Egypt, China, India, Mesoamerica, Southern Africa, Aboriginal Australia, and pre-Christian Europe, 8 civilizations with no verified contact between several of these regions for the entire span of their independent development, all converge on the same core elements: a serpentine or reptilian being, older than humanity, vastly more advanced or powerful, tied to the sky or to primal creative forces, frequently credited with either creating or civilizing the human race, and in more than one tradition, explicitly capable of taking human form. Mainstream anthropology offers an explanation rooted in evolutionary psychology, arguing that fear of snakes is one of the most deeply hardwired instinctive responses in the human brain, likely inherited from millions of years of primate evolution spent avoiding venomous predators, and that this shared instinctive dread naturally produced parallel serpent mythologies without requiring any real contact or shared origin at all. It is a reasonable scientific position, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than dismissed. But proponents of the Alpha-Draconian theory argue this explanation strains under the weight of specificity. A shared instinctive fear of snakes could plausibly explain why cultures independently invented dangerous serpent monsters. It does a poorer job explaining why so many of these same cultures independently describe these beings not simply as monsters, but as civilizers, teachers of agriculture and writing, sources of royal bloodlines, architects of rivers and mountains, and above all, beings capable of assuming human shape and walking among the people they ruled. That last detail, repeated from India to Southern Africa to Slavic Europe in traditions with no possible contact between them, is the thread this entire investigation is going to keep pulling on, because if these ancient accounts were describing something real rather than metaphorical, the logical follow-up question is unavoidable. If they could pass as human, then why would anyone expect them to have stopped now? There is a second layer to the anthropological counter-argument worth addressing directly, because it is the strongest objection researchers in this field regularly face, and a serious investigation does not skip past its strongest objections. Skeptics point out that snakes and large predators were a genuine survival threat to early hominids for millions of years, and that fear of being struck by a hidden, fast-moving, venomous animal is one of the most consistently documented instinctive responses across primate species generally, not just humans, suggesting the raw material for serpent mythology did not need to come from an actual encounter with an intelligent alien species at all. This is a legitimate point, and honest researchers in this field concede it explains a great deal, particularly the sheer number of cultures that developed dangerous serpent stories in the first place. Where the explanation becomes strained, proponents argue, is in accounting for the specific, non-instinctive, highly organized details that appear again and again across cultures with no contact. Serpent beings as founders of royal bloodlines, serpent beings as teachers of writing and agriculture, serpent beings organized into cities and kingdoms with kings and hierarchies, and serpent beings capable of assuming human shape. An instinctive fear response, evolutionary psychologists generally agree, produces simple threat archetypes: a monster to be avoided or slain, Not a detailed socio-political structure complete with underground capital cities, royal lineages, and the specific technical ability to disguise oneself as human in order to move among the very population that fears the archetype. The theory does not ask anyone to abandon the evolutionary explanation for why snakes are frightening. It asks a narrower and more specific question: why does an unrelated set of civilizations, separated by oceans and thousands of years, all independently add the same unusual and specific layer of detail on top of that base fear? And why does that layer so consistently describe a hidden, organized, human-passing society rather than a simple monster? That question is where the trail goes from ancient stone and clay into living testimony, eyewitness accounts, and a phenomenon reported with startling consistency in the modern era by people with no access to Sumerian tablets or Zulu oral tradition, who nonetheless describe seeing the same thing the ancient world tried to warn us about. That is where this investigation goes next. The eye flash phenomenon, when the mask allegedly slips. If ancient mythology across 8 unconnected civilizations agrees on one specific, unusual detail, it is that these serpent beings were never described as monsters confined to caves or oceans. They were described as beings capable of walking among humans in a convincing human shape. The Naga of India could become fully human at will. The Zmej Gorenik of Slavic tradition was said to transform into a handsome man to move undetected through villages. If that ability were real rather than folklore, it would leave behind almost no forensic trace, by definition, because a perfect disguise leaves no evidence of itself. Unless proponents of the Alpha-Draconian theory argue the disguise is not perfect. Unless there are moments, brief and involuntary, when whatever mechanism produces the human appearance falters, and for a fraction of a second, something underneath becomes visible. This is the foundation of what has become known online and among researchers in this field as the eye flash phenomenon, and it forms the second proof in this investigation because it is the single most widely circulated category of alleged modern evidence for reptilian beings living among the general population. The core claim is specific and consistent across thousands of independently submitted reports gathered by researchers and online communities over more than 2 decades. Witnesses describe watching another person, sometimes in ordinary daily life and sometimes on broadcast television, and observing a sudden, momentary change in the eyes. The iris appearing to shift color, frequently described as flashing to a shade of amber, gold, or yellow-green. The pupil appearing to elongate from its normal round shape into a vertical slit, the same pupil shape found in many reptile species. And in the most detailed accounts, a simultaneous shift in the surrounding skin, described as briefly appearing rougher, tighter, or faintly patterned, before the person's ordinary human appearance reasserts itself, typically within 1 to 2 seconds. The consistency of this specific triad, iris color, pupil shape, and skin texture, reported independently by witnesses with no connection to one another across different countries and different decades, is what researchers in this field point to as evidence. The reports are describing a real, shared, observed phenomenon, rather than each witness independently inventing an identical and highly specific hallucination. The phenomenon entered mainstream conspiracy discourse largely through the British author David Icke, whose 1999 book The Biggest Secret first popularized the theory for a broad Western audience, arguing that a bloodline of shape-shifting reptilian entities had infiltrated positions of political, religious, and financial power across the planet and maintained a human disguise through some form of vibrational or dimensional manipulation that could, under specific conditions of stress or intense emotion, momentarily fail. Icke's work drew in part on testimony from self-described former insiders, most notably a woman using the pseudonym Arizona Wilder, who gave lengthy filmed interviews in the early 2000s describing what she said she personally witnessed during closed-door ceremonial gatherings among political and financial elites. Individuals, she said, transformed visibly from human appearance into a reptilian form during ritual settings, complete with elongated features, scaled skin, and the same slitted eyes reported in the broader eye flash phenomenon. Wilder's testimony has never been independently corroborated by any third party, and mainstream researchers treat it as unverifiable personal claim rather than established fact, a limitation this investigation is not going to paper over. But her account matters here for a specific reason. It was one of the first modern testimonies to describe the transformation itself as an observable, if rare and fleeting, physical event, rather than a permanent hidden truth that could never surface. And it set the template that the far larger volume of ordinary, unconnected eyewitness reports would go on to independently match in the years that followed, without those later witnesses necessarily having any knowledge of Wilder's specific account. What makes the eye flash phenomenon different from a simple ghost story or urban legend is the sheer volume of video evidence submitted around it, almost entirely captured accidentally rather than deliberately staged. Beginning in the mid-2000s, as camcorders and later smartphone cameras became universal, viral clips began circulating across early video sharing platforms, showing individuals on live broadcast television, most often news anchors, government spokespeople, and public officials speaking under studio lighting, whose eyes appear in a single frame or a short sequence of frames to shift in exactly the manner described by witnesses. A brief flash of unnatural color, a momentary narrowing of the pupil into a vertical line, sometimes accompanied by what viewers described as an almost imperceptible flattening or stretching of the facial features around the eyes, occurring in less than a tenth of a second and only detectable when the footage is slowed down or paused frame by frame. Communities of amateur video analysts formed specifically around this practice, developing shared techniques for identifying candidate clips, isolating the relevant frames, and cataloging them by broadcast date, network, and individual, building what amounts to a large, decentralized, crowdsourced video archive spanning close to 2 decades of footage. Skeptics offer a set of technical explanations for this footage, and a serious investigation has to weigh them honestly rather than dismiss them, because several of them carry real scientific weight. Older analog and early digital broadcast footage, particularly anything recorded on interlaced video formats, common through the 1990s and 2000s, is built from 2 alternating fields of horizontal scan lines, captured at slightly different moments in time and combined into a single frame. When a subject's eyes move rapidly, as they naturally do many times per minute even during calm speech, the 2 interlaced fields can briefly fail to align correctly, producing a visual artifact where the eye appears distorted, doubled, or oddly shaped for a single frame, an effect well documented in video engineering literature and completely unrelated to the subject's actual physical appearance. Camera lighting is a second major factor. Studio lighting rigs, particularly older tungsten and fluorescent setups, frequently produce colored reflections and lens flares on the cornea that can appear as a sudden color shift when a subject's eye catches the light at a specific angle for a fraction of a second, an effect any photographer who has dealt with reflective catchlights will recognize immediately. Video compression algorithms used by broadcast networks and later by platforms hosting re-uploaded clips introduce their own artifacts, particularly around high-contrast edges like the boundary between iris and sclera, sometimes producing color banding or blockiness that can be mistaken for a genuine change in eye color when viewed at low resolution or after multiple re-encodings, which is common for clips that have been downloaded, re-uploaded, and recompressed dozens of times as they circulate. There is also a documented medical explanation that applies to a smaller subset of cases. Benign essential anisocoria, a real and relatively common condition in which a person's 2 pupils are naturally slightly different sizes, can under certain lighting conditions and camera angles create an illusion of irregular pupil shape when only part of one pupil is visible at the edge of an eyelid, and rapid emotional states such as anger, excitement, or stress genuinely do cause measurable, real, and well-documented pupil dilation and constriction in every human being, a normal autonomic nervous system response that has nothing to do with reptilian ancestry, but could plausibly account for witnesses perceiving a dramatic, unnatural-seeming change in someone's eyes during a tense or emotionally charged exchange. Researchers who continue to take the phenomenon seriously, despite these explanations, make 2 counter-arguments worth stating plainly. First, they argue that while interlacing artifacts, lighting reflections, and compression errors can explain individual clips in isolation, They do not obviously explain why the specific artifact produced is so consistently the same one, a vertical slit pupil and an amber or gold color shift, rather than a random assortment of different visual distortions, which is what a purely technical artifact process would be expected to produce across such a wide variety of different cameras, formats, lighting setups, and compression algorithms over 2 decades. Second, they point to a smaller subset of reports, harder to dismiss on technical grounds because they involve no camera or video at all, describing direct in-person witnesses, often family members, co-workers, or acquaintances of the person involved, who report observing the same eye and skin phenomenon during a face-to-face encounter, typically during a moment of sudden intense anger or fear on the part of the person being observed, with no lighting rig, no interlacing, no compression, and no video artifact of any kind available to explain what the witness says they saw with their own unaided eyes at close range. These in-person accounts share a striking amount of structural consistency with each other, even though the witnesses submitting them are, in the large majority of documented cases, unaware of one another's existence. The reported trigger is almost always the same: a sudden spike of strong emotion, most commonly anger or a perceived threat in the person being observed. The described sequence is almost always the same: a brief, involuntary flash lasting a second or less, followed by an immediate return to a completely ordinary human appearance, often accompanied by the person appearing to catch themselves, becoming suddenly guarded or evasive, or abruptly ending the interaction, and the described physical details are almost always drawn from the same narrow set: vertical pupil constriction, a shift toward amber, gold or pale green in the iris, and a brief textural change in the surrounding skin. Researchers argue that if these accounts were simple invented lies or ordinary misperception, there is no obvious mechanism that would cause thousands of unconnected witnesses submitting reports independently over 20 years, in different countries, in different languages, describing different individuals in different unrelated situations, to all converge on the same narrow and specific set of details, rather than producing the kind of wide, inconsistent variation typical of genuinely fabricated or misremembered testimony. None of this, on its own, constitutes conclusive physical proof, and it would be dishonest to present it that way. What it establishes is a real, well-documented, decades-long, cross-cultural pattern of testimony describing a specific and consistent physical anomaly, backed by a large volume of circulated video that skeptics can explain individually through known technical artifacts, but struggle to explain collectively as to why the artifact is always the same one, layered on top of an ancient mythological record from part 1 of this investigation that already, independently, insisted these beings were capable of holding a human disguise that could occasionally, briefly, fail. Whether that failure point is a real biological event or a shared cultural pattern of misperception reinforced by decades of the same conspiracy theory circulating online, is a judgment this investigation leaves open for now, because the next piece of evidence does not rely on a flickering frame of video at all. It comes from people who claim they went past the flash entirely, underground, into the places these beings are alleged to actually live. Beneath Archuleta Mesa, the underground base and hybrid program testimony. If the eye flash phenomenon describes a disguise briefly failing in public, the next logical question is where these beings are alleged to operate when the disguise is not needed at all. Part 1 already established that this answer is not new. Hindu cosmology placed the Naga kingdoms beneath the earth in the realm of Patala. Credo Mutwa's Zulu tradition described the Chitauri as beings tied to subterranean origins long before they surfaced to subjugate early humanity. The pattern of an underground parallel civilization is not a 20th century invention grafted onto old folklore. It is one of the oldest and most consistent details in the entire record. What changed in the second half of the 20th century is that, for the first time, people in the modern industrial world began coming forward, by name and in public, claiming to have physically located and entered one of these underground facilities themselves. In the mountains of northern New Mexico, beneath a rock formation called Archuleta Mesa, near a small town called Dulce. The central figure in this proof is Philip Schneider, a man who publicly identified himself as a geologist and structural engineer who had spent years working on classified United States government excavation projects, drilling and blasting deep underground facilities as part of black-budget infrastructure contracts. Beginning in 1995, Schneider began giving public lectures, several of which were recorded and continue to circulate, in which he described a specific and violent incident he said took place in 1979 during excavation work near Dulce when his drilling crew broke through into an existing cavern system and encountered what he described as non-human entities already present underground, entities he described in his lectures as tall, gray-skinned beings working alongside a separate and more dominant reptilian faction. Schneider claimed the encounter escalated into an armed confrontation, describing the use of a small tactical nuclear device and conventional weapons in a firefight that he said killed a majority of the 60-plus military and civilian personnel present, and left him with permanent physical injuries, which he displayed to lecture audiences, including scarring he attributed to a plasma-based weapon he said was used against him by one of the entities. Schneider died in January 1996, less than a year after his lecture tour began. The death was ruled a suicide by the medical examiner, a ruling his family has publicly stated they find difficult to fully accept given the circumstances, while critics of Schneider's claims point to a documented history of financial and personal difficulties in the years before his death as a more conventional explanation for his state of mind. Both of these things, the unresolved family doubts and the documented personal struggles, are part of the honest record here, and neither one by itself proves or disproves the substance of what he claimed to have witnessed underground. Schneider's account did not exist in isolation. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, a set of documents and photographs began circulating in early conspiracy research circles, attributed to a man using the name Thomas Costello, who claimed to have worked as a security officer inside the Dulce facility itself before going into hiding after what he described as the same 1979 incident Schneider later referenced publicly. The material attributed to Costello, commonly referred to among researchers as the Dulce Papers, described a sprawling multi-level underground complex with upper levels containing conventional government office and laboratory space, and successively deeper levels, according to the account, housing increasingly restricted research, including what Costello's material described as large cylindrical containment tanks holding unidentified biological specimens, suspended in fluid, refrigerated storage areas containing what the documents described as human and animal tissue in significant quantity, and lower-level laboratories where the account claimed genetic material from humans was being combined experimentally with material from at least two distinct non-human sources, one of which the documents consistently describe using the same reptilian characteristics found throughout this investigation, and a second, smaller-statured gray skin type described as functioning in what the documents characterized as a subordinate worker-class role beneath a reptilian command structure. No independent party has ever authenticated the original Costello documents. No verified photograph of Costello himself exists, and mainstream researchers treat the entire body of material as unverifiable at best. This investigation states that limitation plainly, rather than presenting the Dulce Papers as settled fact. The claimed purpose behind this alleged joint human-reptilian gray genetic program is where the underground-based testimony connects directly to a wider category of testimony gathered independently and separately from people describing personal abduction experiences, a category this investigation examines in full later on. Researchers who compile these accounts describe a recurring explanation offered across otherwise unconnected testimony that the beings involved, whatever their exact origin, are engaged in a long-term genetic program intended either to stabilize a declining reproductive capacity within their own population by introducing human genetic material, or to produce a viable hybrid lineage capable of functioning within human society undetected, a purpose that, if true, would represent an evolution of the same disguise capability described in Part 2, moving from a temporary shape-shifting mechanism to a permanent, inheritable one, achieved through direct genetic combination rather than momentary transformation. It is worth stating explicitly that this claimed motive is speculative even within the community of researchers who take the underlying testimony seriously, and several competing explanations circulate for why such a program would exist, ranging from simple biological necessity to a colder, more calculated argument that hybridization was intended from the outset as a long-term method of population control and integration. A separate and, in a narrow sense, more independently documented body of evidence gets folded into this proof by researchers, though it deserves to be treated with real care because its mainstream explanation is considerably stronger than the explanations available for Schneider's testimony or the Dulce papers. Beginning in the late 1960s and accelerating through the 1970s, ranchers across the American West concentrated heavily in Colorado and New Mexico, the same region as the alleged Dulce facility, began reporting the deaths of cattle under conditions they described as deeply unusual: precise, clean-edged removal of specific organs and soft tissue, most commonly the reproductive organs, tongue, and rectum, complete drainage of blood from the carcass, with no blood found pooled at the scene, and a consistent absence of predator tracks, scavenger activity, or struggle marks in the surrounding ground, even in cases discovered within hours of death. Local law enforcement, veterinary examiners, and eventually federal agencies investigated numerous cases across multiple states over more than a decade, and the phenomenon was widely reported in mainstream regional and national press at the time, making it one of the only elements in this entire body of evidence with a substantial contemporaneous paper trail generated by parties with no connection to UFO research whatsoever. The dominant explanation offered by veterinary pathologists and government investigators who studied the phenomenon attributes the apparently clean incisions to the natural bloating and skin-splitting pattern that occurs during decomposition, which can produce edges that appear deceptively straight, and attributes the absence of blood and scavenger activity to normal predator and insect feeding behavior, which often targets the same soft tissue areas first and can be mistaken for surgical removal by an examiner unfamiliar with decomposition patterns in livestock. Researchers who maintain a connection between the mutilation phenomenon and the broader Alpha-Draconian theory argue this explanation does not comfortably account for every documented case, particularly the more heavily investigated incidents where veterinary examiners on scene at the time explicitly stated in their own reports that the wound margins did not resemble anything they associated with predation or natural decomposition, and they connect the geographic concentration of these cases in the exact region where Schneider and Costello's testimony places an active underground genetic research facility as significant rather than coincidental, suggesting the tissue and blood collected may have been intended as raw material for the same hybridization program described in the underground testimony. What can be said with confidence, separating the well-documented from the unverifiable, is this: the cattle mutilation phenomenon is real in the sense that a large number of well-documented, professionally investigated, unusual livestock deaths did occur across the American West over an extended period, generating a genuine unsolved case file that mainstream science addresses through decomposition and predation explanations that many investigators at the time found only partially satisfying. The underground facility testimony from Schneider and the Costello documents is real only in the sense that the testimony itself genuinely exists and was given publicly, while the specific claims it contains, the facility, the firefight, the genetic tanks, remain entirely uncorroborated by any independent physical evidence, despite the fact that Archuleta Mesa and the surrounding Dulce area have been the subject of extensive amateur searching, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by independent researchers and repeated attempts to locate a physical entrance, none of which have produced a verified result accepted outside of conspiracy research circles. Skeptics reasonably point out that a genuinely vast, decades-old, multi-level underground facility housing an active genetic program would be exceptionally difficult to conceal completely from satellite thermal imaging, seismic monitoring, groundwater surveys, and the ordinary movement of construction equipment and personnel required to build and supply it, and that the absence of any of these secondary indicators over more than 40 years is itself meaningful evidence against the claim's literal truth. Proponents respond that a technologically superior, non-human intelligence, or a human government partner, sophisticated enough to keep the underlying program compartmentalized at the highest classification levels for over 4 decades, is by definition operating with capabilities and disciplined secrecy that would specifically be designed to defeat exactly this kind of conventional detection, an argument that is difficult to disprove but equally difficult to independently verify. And this investigation presents it to you exactly at that level of uncertainty, rather than pretending the matter is closed in either direction. What moves the investigation forward from here is not the physical location of a facility, which remains unconfirmed, but the growing body of testimony from a different category of source entirely. People who never claim to have worked underground at Dulce, who in many cases have never heard of Phil Schneider or the Costello documents, but who nonetheless spent careers inside military and intelligence institutions and came forward independently describing a pattern of official awareness of a non-human presence that goes far beyond any single facility. That testimony, gathered from senior officers, defense contractors, and intelligence officials speaking on the record under their own names, is the next proof in this investigation. And unlike the material in this part, a meaningful portion of it cannot be waved away as anonymous or unverifiable, because the people making these specific claims held security clearances, official titles, and public reputations they were risking by speaking at all. The men who signed their names. Military and intelligence testimony. Anonymous testimony can always be dismissed on the grounds of anonymity, and pseudonymous testimony can always be dismissed on the grounds that no one can verify who is actually speaking. Both of those objections are fair, and both of them applied to significant portions of the material covered in the previous part. What makes the next category of evidence harder to dismiss on those specific grounds is that it comes from people who did not hide. They gave their real names, their real ranks, their real service records, and in several cases, their real publicly documented military and government careers, knowing exactly what it would cost them professionally and socially to make the claims they made. And they made those claims anyway, on camera, in print, and in some cases under oath. William Cooper is the starting point for this proof, not because his claims are the most credible in isolation, but because his 1991 book, Behold a Pale Horse, became one of the single most influential documents in shaping the entire modern conspiracy landscape around government knowledge of non-human life, and because his own account of how he came to his information is a matter of public record rather than something reconstructed after his death. Cooper served in the United States Navy, including a documented posting to the USS Tuscaloosa, and claimed that during his service he was briefed as part of a naval intelligence team on classified material describing ongoing contact between elements of the United States government and multiple non-human groups, including a faction he described in explicitly reptilian and explicitly hostile terms, which he said operated from a position of dominance over a separate, smaller, gray-skinned faction working in a subordinate role, a hierarchy that matches, detail for detail, the same structure described independently by Phil Schneider and the Costello material examined in the previous part, despite Cooper developing and publishing his account before either of those other sources had gone public. Cooper also became one of the earliest and most vocal critics of the so-called MJ-12 documents, a set of papers purporting to detail a secret committee established under President Truman to manage alien contact, which Cooper argued convincingly, and which most researchers on all sides now broadly accept, were very likely fabricated, in some cases, possibly by intelligence elements themselves, as a form of controlled disinformation designed to discredit the broader topic by association. A detail worth including here because it demonstrates Cooper was capable of rigorous skepticism toward other people's claims, even while advancing his own. Cooper's life ended in November 2001 in an armed confrontation with sheriff's deputies at his home in Arizona following a lengthy standoff connected to an outstanding warrant. Official accounts describe Cooper firing on deputies who returned fire, while Cooper's supporters have argued for over 2 decades that the circumstances were engineered to silence him, a dispute this investigation cannot resolve, and states honestly rather than adopting either position as settled fact. A second figure who spoke under his own name and rank is Sergeant First Class Clifford Stone, a United States Army veteran who died in 2023 and who spent the final decades of his life giving public on-record testimony, including formal sworn testimony recorded as part of Dr. Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project in the year 2000, describing his claimed role in military retrieval operations involving downed non-human craft and, in several specific instances, non-human remains. Stone's most widely cited claim was that during his service, he was tasked with helping compile and maintain a classified internal document cataloging distinct extraterrestrial types known to or encountered by United States military and intelligence personnel. A list, Stone said, eventually grew to well over 50 separate identified types by the time of his involvement, several of which he described in his recorded testimony using explicitly reptilian characteristics, distinct from the more commonly referenced small grayskin type, and which he described as occupying a more senior or authoritative position relative to other non-human groups referenced in the same catalog. Stone maintained this account consistently across more than 2 decades of public statements, interviews, and formal testimony given under his own name, without the financial windfall that might explain sustained fabrication for profit, since Stone was never a commercially prominent author or conference headliner on the scale of some other figures in this field, a fact researchers sympathetic to his testimony point to directly when arguing his motive was disclosure rather than income. Stone's formal testimony was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger, coordinated effort organized by Dr. Stephen Greer, an emergency medicine physician who founded the Disclosure Project, specifically to gather on-record statements from military, intelligence, government, and corporate aerospace witnesses willing to attach their real names and credentials to claims about non-human contact and government awareness of it. In May 2001, Greer convened a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., at which more than 20 credentialed witnesses, including former military officers, air traffic controllers, and government contractors, gave public statements about their direct professional experiences with unidentified craft and, in a smaller number of cases, claimed knowledge of retrieved non-human remains or ongoing classified programs studying them. The event received substantial contemporaneous press coverage precisely because of the seniority and verifiable service records of a meaningful portion of the participants, even though it produced no shift in official government policy or acknowledgement at the time. Not every witness at the 2001 press conference described reptilian entities specifically. The majority of testimony that day concerned craft sightings, radar confirmation, and encounters with the smaller gray-type entities more commonly referenced across the broader UFO research field. But a minority of the witnesses, speaking in follow-up interviews and later independent statements outside the press conference itself, extended their testimony to describe a hierarchy among non-human groups consistent with the reptilian dominant gray subordinate structure that recurs across Cooper's, Schneider's, Stone's, and the Costello materials' independent accounts. A more recent and considerably more contested body of testimony comes from a man named Corey Goode, who beginning around 2014 became the central public voice of what its proponents call the secret space program disclosure movement. Goode's claims are substantially more elaborate than the earlier testimony examined in this part, describing decades of alleged personal involvement, beginning in childhood, in a covert human space program operating advanced craft far beyond publicly acknowledged aerospace technology, and describing extensive direct interaction with multiple distinct non-human civilizations, including what Goode consistently refers to as a Draco-Reptilian Federation, which he describes not as a single unified group, but as a large, internally stratified empire exercising influence over numerous other non-human groups, and, according to Good's account, over segments of human civilization as well, operating from a position of significant technological and political dominance relative to Earth. Good's testimony is treated with considerably more skepticism, including by many researchers otherwise sympathetic to the broader Alpha-Draconian theory, for several specific reasons that deserve to be stated clearly. Unlike Cooper, Stone, or Schneider, Good has no independently verifiable military or government service record supporting his core claims of decades-long covert involvement, and journalists and researchers who have attempted to trace his employment and educational history during the years he claims to have been serving off-world have generally found gaps and inconsistencies rather than corroboration. Good's account has also evolved and expanded considerably over the years since 2014, incorporating new details, new alliances, and new non-human factions in a pattern that critics argue resembles serialized narrative development more than the static recollection of remembered events, and Good has derived meaningful commercial income from conference appearances, books, and a subscription-based content platform built around his ongoing testimony, a financial incentive structure notably different from Stone's. This investigation includes Good's testimony because it represents the most detailed and internally elaborate modern account of an organized Draco-Reptilian civilization available anywhere in this field, and because significant elements of his description, particularly the reptilian dominant hierarchical structure, align with the earlier and more conservatively sourced testimony from Cooper and Stone, but it includes that testimony with the specific and significant credibility caveats stated here, rather than presenting it with the same weight as testimony backed by a verifiable service record. Taken together, this body of testimony has a genuine internal consistency worth sitting with honestly. Cooper, developing his account from a claimed naval intelligence briefing in the late 1980s, and Stone, developing his account from a claimed Army retrieval team assignment across a similar period, arrived independently at the same basic structural claim: a hierarchy of non-human groups with a reptilian faction positioned at or near the top, and a smaller gray-skinned faction operating beneath it. A claim that would later be echoed again, decades apart, and through an entirely different and far more speculative channel in Good's account. That structural consistency across sources with different levels of credibility, different eras, and by their own description different and unconnected access points into classified material, is precisely what proponents of the theory point to as meaningful corroboration, while skeptics point to the same consistency as evidence that later claimants, including Good, were likely influenced, consciously or not, by Cooper's widely published 1991 account, which had over a decade to circulate and shape the folklore before Stone's formal testimony, and well over 2 decades before Good's public emergence, making independent convergence considerably less certain than it might first appear. It is also true, and worth stating without hedging, that not one piece of physical evidence, no retrieved craft component, no biological sample, no classified document with a verified chain of custody has ever been produced by any witness in this category and independently authenticated by a source outside the conspiracy research community itself, a limitation that applies to every name in this part equally, and that any honest accounting of this evidence has to carry forward rather than set aside. What the testimony in this part does establish, regardless of where any individual viewer ultimately lands on its reliability, is that the reptilian dominant hierarchy is not a claim invented once and then simply repeated by an echo chamber. It was arrived at, or at minimum asserted, by multiple people with different backgrounds, different eras of claimed access, and different personal incentives, several of whom put their real names and military records behind it in a way anonymous testimony never can. Whether that convergence reflects a shared underlying truth these witnesses each encountered from a different angle, or a shared cultural mythology that each man absorbed and then sincerely reframed as personal memory, is the central open question running underneath this entire investigation, and it is one this script is not going to resolve for you by force. What it can do is keep building the case, layer by layer, and the next layer moves out of testimony entirely and into something that can be measured, photographed, and examined directly. The symbols these same beings are alleged to have left stamped into the architecture, currency, and institutions of the modern world, hidden in plain sight for anyone who knows where to look. hidden in plain sight, serpent symbolism in the modern world. If the beings described across the first 4 parts of this investigation have truly influenced human civilization from a position of hidden authority for thousands of years, as the ancient mythology, the eyewitness testimony, and the military accounts all separately claim, then researchers in this field argue there is one place that influence would be almost impossible to fully erase: the symbols a civilization chooses to carve into its most important buildings, mint onto its currency, and place at the gateways travelers pass through every single day. A hidden power structure does not need to announce itself in words. Researchers in this proof argue it reveals itself in the symbols it cannot resist using, because those symbols carry genuine meaning to the people placing them, even when the wider public walks past without a second glance. Begin with medicine, an institution built on trust and physical vulnerability, and one of the most recognizable symbols in the world: 2 serpents coiled around a winged staff, known as the caduceus. Mainstream historical scholarship traces this specific image to the staff of Hermes, the Greek messenger god associated with commerce, travel, and communication between worlds, and points out, correctly, that the symbol most anatomically and historically tied to healing in classical antiquity was actually a different image entirely: the rod of Asclepius, a single serpent wound around a plain wooden staff associated with the Greek god of medicine and used consistently by ancient healing temples across the Mediterranean. The caduceus, by contrast, was never historically associated with medicine in the ancient world at all. Its adoption by American medical organizations and the United States Army Medical Corps in the early 20th century is generally attributed to a documented historical mix-up when the U.S. Army's medical department mistakenly adopted the 2-serpent Hermes symbol instead of the correct single-serpent Asclepius symbol during a 1902 uniform insignia decision, an error that then propagated through American institutional use over the following decades, even as most of the rest of the world continued using the historically correct single serpent version. Mainstream historians treat this simply as a well-documented bureaucratic mistake. Researchers in this field ask a pointed question in response: out of every possible symbol available, why does the specific error that took hold and spread across American medicine, one of the most consequential and trusted institutions in the country, happen to be the version with 2 serpents rather than 1? And why has more than a century of subsequent opportunity to correct the error never resulted in the correction actually being made at the institutional level in the United States? Move from medicine to religious architecture, and consider St. Peter's Square at the Vatican, one of the most photographed public spaces on Earth. Designed in the mid-17th century by the sculptor and architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini, the square is enclosed by 2 vast curving colonnades, each made up of hundreds of columns arranged in a sweeping arc that reaches outward from the basilica and then curls back toward a central point, an architectural form Bernini himself, in his own recorded correspondence, explicitly described as intended to represent the motherly, embracing arms of the Church reaching out to welcome the faithful. Researchers in this field read the same physical layout differently, pointing out that viewed from directly above, a perspective unavailable to anyone standing in the square itself in the 17th century, but readily available to anyone examining an aerial photograph today, the 2 colonnades do not simply resemble open arms. They resemble the 2 curved fangs, or the open encircling coils of a serpent's head, with the obelisk standing at the center of the square positioned exactly where a serpent's tongue or eye would sit within that shape. Mainstream art historians reject this reading entirely, noting that Bernini's own explicit written intent, embracing arms welcoming pilgrims, is about as well documented as architectural intent gets for any building of this age, and that reading a hidden serpent into a shape the architect specifically described in his own words as something else requires overriding the primary historical source in favor of a modern interpretation imposed after the fact. Proponents of the symbolic reading do not generally dispute that Bernini described his own intent that way. They argue instead that architects working for institutions with a hidden agenda would have every reason to publicly describe their work in innocuous, faith-affirming language, regardless of what deeper symbolic instruction they may have privately been given. an argument that is, by its own construction, difficult to disprove through any historical document, since any document supporting the innocent explanation can always be reframed as exactly what a cover story would look like. The Egyptian obelisk sitting at the center of that same square is not unique to Rome. Genuine ancient Egyptian obelisks and their modern replicas appear at the center of major ceremonial spaces across the world, including the Place de la Concorde in Paris, and, in modern replica form, built specifically to evoke the same ancient Egyptian solar and serpent-associated religious tradition covered in Part 1 of this investigation, the Washington Monument in the United States Capitol, completed in 1884, and, for over a century afterward, the tallest structure on Earth built by human hands. The Washington Monument's design was overseen by a design and construction process deeply connected to Freemasonry, a fraternal organization whose own ritual symbolism draws extensively and openly on ancient Egyptian architectural and religious themes. And the monument's cornerstone was laid in a formal Masonic ceremony in 1848, a matter of public historical record rather than speculation. Mainstream historians explain this straightforwardly. 19th century American elite culture, including a large proportion of its founding political class, held a documented fascination with ancient Egyptian civilization and classical antiquity generally, and Freemasonry's own symbolic system had already absorbed Egyptian imagery centuries earlier as part of its broader mythologized account of ancient wisdom traditions, making the presence of an Egyptian obelisk at the heart of American government entirely explainable without invoking any hidden non-human influence at all. Researchers in this field counter that this explanation describes the mechanism of transmission without explaining the underlying motive, and argue that Freemasonry's own internal historical narrative, largely undisputed even by Masons themselves, explicitly traces its symbolic inheritance back through cultures already covered in Part 1 of this investigation as centers of serpent-being reverence, making the obelisk less a matter of simple aesthetic fashion and more the visible tip of a much older continuous symbolic tradition passed down through exactly the institutions positioned to shape a nation's founding architecture. No single modern location has generated more sustained public fascination within this specific field than Denver International Airport, which opened in 1995 after a construction process that ran significantly over budget and behind schedule, and which has since become the single most discussed piece of alleged hidden symbolism architecture in the world. Several elements of the airport invite the scrutiny independently of any pre-existing theory. A dedication capstone in the main terminal is engraved with Masonic symbols, including the square and compass, and credits its installation to an organization formally named the New World Airport Commission, a name that has never been definitively traced to any other public record, leading researchers to question why an organization with no other documented civic footprint anywhere would be responsible for dedicating one of the largest airports on Earth. A series of large murals painted by the artist Leo Tanguma depict apocalyptic and militarized imagery, including armed soldiers, a child lying in a coffin surrounded by weeping mourners of multiple ethnicities, and a green uniformed figure wielding a sword and wearing a gas mask standing over a dove and a destroyed cityscape. Artwork Tanguma has publicly stated in interviews was intended as a message of hope and eventual world peace following depicted global conflict, a straightforward artistic statement that has done little to slow decades of alternative interpretation given the mural's genuinely unsettling visual tone. Deep within the airport's baggage claim area sits a small stone gargoyle sculpture, positioned as though guarding luggage, carved with elongated features and a texture some visitors describe as distinctly reptilian rather than the traditional European gargoyle form, officially explained by airport officials as a light-hearted architectural nod to the gargoyles of historic European train stations and cathedrals watching over travelers, an explanation that satisfies most visitors, but not the researchers in this field, who point out that if reptilian beings genuinely maintain influence over major infrastructure projects, a small, easily dismissed sculpture tucked into a low-traffic baggage corridor is exactly the kind of low-risk, plausible deniability location such a symbol would be placed. Finally, and most darkly, a 32-foot fiberglass sculpture of a rearing blue Mustang with glowing red eyes, created by the sculptor Luis Jimenez and now widely known by the unofficial nickname Blucifer, stands beside the airport's entrance road. During its construction in 2006, a section of the sculpture broke loose from its rigging and fell on Jimenez, severing an artery in his leg and killing him before the piece was even completed, a documented, verifiable tragedy that researchers in this field routinely cite, not as proof of any specific claim, but as the kind of unsettling coincidence that keeps the airport's broader symbolic reputation alive in the public imagination, regardless of how many individual elements receive mundane official explanations. It is worth stating plainly that every individual claim examined in this part has an available conventional explanation, several of them well documented and historically verifiable on their own terms. A genuine 19th century army insignia error, an architect's own explicit written intent, a well-documented cultural fashion for Egyptian revival architecture among 19th century elites, an artist's stated intent to convey hope after conflict, a whimsical nod to European cathedral gargoyles, and a tragic but mechanically explicable construction accident. Skeptics argue that the pattern researchers in this field see across these locations is a well-studied cognitive phenomenon called apophenia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful connections and patterns in random or unrelated data, amplified in this specific case by confirmation bias, in which a person already primed to look for reptilian symbolism will naturally notice and remember every ambiguous serpentine shape in classical architecture, which after all draws on the same limited set of ancient decorative traditions across thousands of buildings worldwide, while ignoring the vastly larger number of buildings and symbols that contain no such imagery at all. Researchers in this field do not generally deny that any single example, taken alone, could be coincidence. Their argument rests instead on volume and consistency, that the specific symbolic vocabulary connecting serpents, ancient Egypt, hidden fraternal organizations, and positions of significant civic and religious authority recurs across an improbably large number of the world's most important buildings, institutions, and spaces of power, built across different centuries by different architects working in different countries, and that the cumulative weight of that recurrence, even after subtracting every individually explicable example, leaves behind a residue too consistent to fully dismiss as chance. Symbols carved into stone and painted onto murals can only take this investigation so far, because a symbol, however suggestive, is not a body and it is not a direct encounter. The next proof moves away from architecture entirely and into one of the most personally reported and psychologically studied phenomena connected to this entire subject: the experiences of people who describe, in vivid and often traumatic detail, direct physical encounters with reptilian entities during what researchers in the wider UFO field call the abduction phenomenon, a body of testimony gathered from thousands of independent witnesses across decades examined next in this investigation. The abduction phenomenon, first-hand encounter testimony. Every proof examined so far in this investigation has approached its subject from a distance. Ancient texts describing beings from a remote past, symbols carved into buildings by hands long dead, testimony from men describing what they say happened to other people underground, decades ago, in places the public still cannot verify. The sixth proof is different because it is built entirely on people describing what they say happened directly to their own bodies, often repeatedly, across years or decades of their own lives, and it is the single most personally documented and most extensively studied category of evidence in this entire field, examined not only by conspiracy researchers, but by credentialed psychiatrists, historians, and clinical psychologists working at major academic institutions. The modern alien abduction phenomenon, as a documented category of testimony, is generally traced by researchers to the case of Betty and Barney Hill, a Massachusetts couple who in September 1961 reported a period of missing time following a nighttime encounter with an unidentified craft, later recovering, through hypnotic regression sessions conducted by a Boston psychiatrist, detailed memories of having been taken aboard a craft and physically examined by non-human beings. The Hill case, extensively covered by mainstream press at the time and the subject of a best-selling book and a network television film in the years that followed, established the basic narrative structure that would recur across thousands of subsequently reported cases, a period of consciously remembered missing time, recovered memories of onboard examination, often only accessible through hypnosis, physical paralysis during the experience, and a strong emotional residue of fear persisting long after the event itself. The Hill case and the large majority of abduction cases reported through the 1960s, 70s, and 80s describe the beings involved using the now familiar small, gray-skinned, large-headed, large-eyed form that dominates popular culture's image of an alien. Serious academic engagement with the phenomenon followed, most notably through the work of Dr. John Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard Medical School psychiatrist who began formally interviewing self-described abductees in the early 1990s and, in his 1994 book Abduction, argued that the consistency, emotional authenticity, and psychological profile of the experiencers he interviewed did not match known patterns of psychiatric illness or deliberate fabrication, a conclusion that generated significant controversy within Harvard's own faculty and the broader psychiatric community, without Mack himself ever claiming to have proven the literal physical reality of what his patients described. Parallel research was conducted over the same period by Bud Hopkins, an artist and self-taught researcher who conducted hundreds of hypnotic regression interviews and argued for a covert, multi-generational genetic breeding program as the underlying purpose behind the pattern, and by Dr. David Jacobs, a tenured historian at Temple University who continued conducting and publishing hypnotic regression research on the phenomenon throughout his academic career. Within this much larger body of gray entity testimony, a distinct and smaller subset of reports has consistently described a different and considerably more unsettling category of being: tall, muscular, reptilian-featured entities, described by witnesses as possessing scaled or leathery skin, vertically slitted eyes matching the descriptions covered in Part 2, and in a significant number of accounts, occupying a position of clear authority over the smaller gray entities present during the same encounter, directing procedures rather than performing them personally. Witnesses reporting this reptilian variant described the communication involved as occurring telepathically rather than verbally, a detail consistent across the wider abduction literature, regardless of which entity type is being described, and described the emotional tone of the reptilian entities specifically, far more consistently than they described the tone of the gray entities, as cold, clinical, and predatory, with several accounts explicitly using language like being regarded as livestock or a resource rather than as a fellow intelligent being deserving of consideration. A meaningful number of these accounts, gathered independently by different researchers working with different witnesses in different countries, describe the encounters as beginning in early childhood and recurring across the witness's entire lifespan, sometimes reported as continuing across multiple generations within the same family, a multi-generational pattern that researchers in this field connect directly back to the hybridization program testimony examined in Part 3. Simon Parkes is among the most publicly visible living figures associated with this specific category of testimony. Parkes, a British man who served as an elected Labour Party town councillor in Whitby, North Yorkshire, has spoken publicly under his own name since the 1990s about what he describes as encounters beginning at the age of 8, involving multiple distinct non-human types across his lifetime, including gray beings and, significantly for this proof, reptilian entities Parkes describes as connected to his own extended ancestry, a claim that places him within the same bloodline framework referenced by earlier researchers in this field and examined more closely in a later part of this investigation. Parkes's public role as an elected local official while making these claims under his real name is frequently cited by researchers sympathetic to his account as a meaningful factor, since holding elected office in the United Kingdom carries genuine media scrutiny and reputational exposure, a real-world professional risk of the same general category, though considerably smaller in scale, as the risk accepted by the military witnesses examined in Part 4. No honest treatment of this proof can proceed without giving equal serious weight to the leading scientific explanation for the abduction phenomenon as a whole, because it is a genuinely well-supported body of research, and it deserves to be presented with the same rigor as the testimony it challenges. The dominant clinical explanation centers on a well-documented neurological phenomenon called sleep paralysis. a state that occurs when a person's consciousness begins to wake from REM sleep before the muscular paralysis that naturally accompanies REM sleep, intended to prevent the body from physically acting out dreams, has fully released. A person experiencing sleep paralysis is, by definition, awake and aware of their surroundings while physically unable to move or speak, and a substantial body of peer-reviewed research, including work by researchers such as J. Allen Chaney, Susan Blackmore, and Christopher French, has documented that this specific state is very frequently accompanied by vivid, involuntary hallucinations, most commonly a powerful and specific sensation of a malevolent presence in the room, pressure or weight on the chest, and in a substantial minority of cases, fully formed visual hallucinations of a humanoid or non-human figure standing over or approaching the bed. Critically, this research has found that the specific content of these hallucinations, whether the perceived figure is described as a witch, a demon, an old hag sitting on the chest, a shadow person, or an alien, tracks closely with the cultural material the individual has been exposed to prior to the experience. With populations in cultures saturated with alien abduction, narratives in film and television reporting alien-type hallucinations far more frequently than populations in cultures with little exposure to that specific narrative, who instead overwhelmingly report culturally older figures like demons or witches experiencing the same underlying neurological event. This research strongly suggests that sleep paralysis provides the raw neurological experience, and existing cultural narrative provides the specific costume the brain dresses that experience in, without requiring an actual external entity to be physically present in the room at all. A second major scientific concern specific to this proof involves the primary method most researchers in this field have used to gather their most detailed testimony: hypnotic regression. The extensive and rigorously replicated research of the cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, spanning several decades and widely regarded as foundational in the scientific understanding of memory, has demonstrated repeatedly that hypnosis does not function as a reliable playback mechanism for accurate memory, as it was popularly believed to for much of the 20th century. Instead, memories recovered or elaborated under hypnosis are measurably more susceptible to suggestion, more likely to incorporate details introduced by a hypnotist's own questions, even unintentionally, and are recalled by the subject afterward with a level of subjective confidence that is not correlated with their actual accuracy, meaning a hypnotically recovered false memory typically feels every bit as real and certain to the person experiencing it as a hypnotically recovered accurate one. This body of research presents a serious methodological problem for the abduction research tradition established by Hopkins and continued by Jacobs, both of whom relied heavily on hypnotic regression to elicit the most detailed and disturbing portions of their subjects' testimony, since it means a well-meaning researcher who already believes reptilian entities are involved in these encounters could, entirely without conscious intent, shape a hypnotized subject's testimony toward that specific conclusion through the structure and phrasing of their own questions, producing a body of testimony that feels like independent corroboration across many witnesses while actually reflecting the shared influence of the researcher's own leading methodology repeated across every session. Researchers who continue to take the reptilian abduction testimony seriously, despite these two significant scientific challenges, raise 2 points in response that deserve to be stated fairly. First, they note that while sleep paralysis explains a single, brief, largely stationary bedroom experience, well, it does a considerably weaker job explaining the substantial minority of reported cases involving corroborated missing time of several hours, verified by independent physical evidence such as vehicle odometer discrepancies or independently noted arrival time discrepancies by third parties unaware of any paranormal claim at the time, since sleep paralysis by its clinical definition resolves within minutes and does not produce hours of unaccounted time. Second, they point to a smaller number of cases in which multiple witnesses, including in a few well-documented instances entirely unrelated individuals with no prior contact who did not know each other, independently reported experiencing missing time or a shared physical symptom, such as an identical, otherwise unexplained mark or bruise during the same overlapping time window. A pattern that would require an extraordinary coincidence to explain through independent, unrelated sleep paralysis events occurring in unconnected people at the same time, though researchers on the skeptical side note reasonably that such multi-witness cases represent a very small fraction of the total reported testimony and are themselves difficult to verify independently after the fact. What can be said, honestly, at the close of this proof is that the abduction phenomenon is real in the specific sense that a very large volume of people across decades and across cultures sincerely report a consistent and specific set of experiences, that a credible neurological explanation exists which accounts for a substantial portion, likely a majority, of these reports without requiring any external entity at all, and that the primary method used to gather the most detailed reptilian-specific testimony carries a well-documented scientific vulnerability to unintentionally shaping the very testimony it collects. It is equally true that a meaningful minority of reported cases resist full explanation through sleep paralysis alone, and that witnesses like Simon Parks have maintained detailed, consistent accounts publicly and under their own name for decades without the kind of psychiatric diagnosis or personal instability that might otherwise explain sustained fabrication. This investigation is not going to tell you which of those two honest facts should weigh more heavily in your own judgment. What it can tell you is where the testimony consistently points when witnesses describe the reptilian entities themselves, asking not where they came from, but from what direction in the sky. And that specific recurring detail, a direction, a constellation, a point of origin given independently by witnesses who in many cases had never studied astronomy at all, is the subject of the next proof in this investigation. The pole star that watched the pyramids rise, the Draco origin claim. Every category of evidence examined so far in this investigation has answered the question of what these beings are and how they are alleged to operate. This proof addresses a different question, the one witnesses across the abduction testimony in Part 6 describe asking directly and telepathically during their own encounters. Where do they come from? The answer given independently by a wide range of witnesses across decades is a specific constellation in the northern sky, one of the oldest cataloged star patterns in human history, visible every single night from most of the northern hemisphere for the entire span of recorded civilization, a fact that turns out to matter far more than it first appears. The constellation Draco is one of the largest in the night sky and one of the oldest formally recorded, appearing under its Greek name, meaning dragon, in the astronomer Ptolemy's 2nd century catalog, the Almagest, itself compiling observational traditions that stretch back considerably further. Babylonian astronomers, working from a tradition independent of Greek astronomy and considerably older, cataloged the same region of sky under the name Bashmu, described in cuneiform astronomical texts as a horned serpent, placing a serpent-dragon figure in almost exactly this same region of northern sky, in a tradition with no verified direct contact with the later Greek naming convention. What makes Draco astronomically unusual and central to this proof is its position. Draco is circumpolar as seen from most of the northern hemisphere, meaning it never sets below the horizon and remains visible in the night sky throughout the entire year, every year, a physical property shared by only a small number of constellations and one that ancient observers across multiple independent cultures noticed and treated as spiritually significant, because a star pattern that never disappears behaves, to the naked eye, unlike every other visible object in the sky, all of which rise and set on a predictable nightly cycle. This circumpolar property connects directly and verifiably to the Egyptian material examined in Part 1 and Part 5 of this investigation, and here the connection moves from mythological parallel into hard archaeoastronomy. Egyptian funerary religious texts, including material inscribed inside the pyramids themselves known collectively as the pyramid texts, dating to roughly 2400 to 2300 BCE, refer explicitly to a specific category of stars the Egyptians called the imperishable ones, identified by modern Egyptologists as the circumpolar stars precisely because they never set and were therefore associated in Egyptian religious cosmology with eternal life and the eternal reign of the deceased pharaoh's soul, who was believed to join these stars after death. Draco was one of the primary constellations occupying this circumpolar region as seen from ancient Egypt, and more specifically, the star Thuban, designated Alpha-Draconis by modern astronomers and sitting roughly at the midpoint of the constellation's long, winding body, held a position of extraordinary significance during precisely the era the Great Pyramids of Giza were constructed. Due to a slow wobble in Earth's rotational axis called precession, the identity of the star closest to the celestial North Pole changes gradually over a cycle of roughly 26,000 years, and around 2787 BCE, Thuban sat almost exactly at true north, functioning as the pole star for the civilization building its most significant monuments during that precise period, a role the star does not hold today and has not held for roughly 4,000 years. This is not a disputed or speculative fact. It is standard, mainstream, peer-reviewed archaeoastronomy, and it produces a genuinely striking coincidence that even skeptical Egyptologists acknowledge without necessarily accepting any non-human explanation for it. The so-called descending passage of the Great Pyramid at Giza, a long, straight, precisely engineered shaft running from the pyramid's entrance down through its base, aligns when calculated back to the pyramid's construction date almost exactly with the position Thuban occupied in the northern sky at the time, a finding first proposed in published academic astronomy literature by the astronomer Virginia Trimble in 1964 and taken seriously within mainstream Egyptology ever since as at minimum a plausible and mathematically supported alignment, whatever its ultimate religious or engineering purpose actually was. Mainstream Egyptology's own explanation for this alignment does not require any extraterrestrial involvement and is worth stating in full because it is the responsible academic position. Ancient Egyptian priest astronomers are known, from extensive independent evidence, to have possessed sophisticated naked-eye observational astronomy, tracking stellar positions with enough precision to align monuments to cardinal directions and specific stars for calendrical and religious purposes unrelated to any contact with non-human beings, purposes tied entirely to their own well-documented theology concerning the pharaoh's soul ascending to join the imperishable circumpolar stars after death. Under this explanation, the descending passage points at Thuban simply because Thuban was, factually and observably, the pole star of that era, and any sufficiently skilled ancient astronomer anywhere on Earth at that specific moment in history, tracking true celestial north for entirely conventional religious reasons, would have been led to align a north-facing shaft with that exact star, making the alignment a natural consequence of accurate ancient astronomy rather than evidence of any external contact. Researchers in this field do not dispute the mechanism Egyptologists describe. They argue instead that the mechanism and the motive are two separate questions, and that accurate naked-eye tracking of Thuban explains how the alignment was achieved without explaining why an entire civilization's most sacred funerary architecture, at the height of its monumental construction, was built around eternal union with one specific region of sky that, by remarkable coincidence, happens to be the same region multiple independent modern witnesses across a completely different body of testimony gathered thousands of years later with no access to Egyptological research have named as the literal point of origin for the reptilian beings described throughout this investigation. That modern testimony is where this proof moves from archaeoastronomy into contactee and abduction literature directly. Among the most prominent living figures associated with the specific claim of a draconian star origin is Alex Collier, an American man who has spoken and written publicly under his own name since the mid-1990s, describing sustained contact beginning in 1994 with a group he refers to as the Andromeda Council, and who has consistently described, across nearly 3 decades of public lectures, interviews, and published material, a large and technologically dominant reptilian empire originating from the Draco constellation as one of the central antagonist civilizations in the broader account he presents. A civilization he describes as having interfered in human affairs for thousands of years for reasons connected to resource control and genetic material, a claim that lines up closely with the hybridization program testimony already examined in Part 3. Collier's testimony is entirely unverifiable through any independent means available to conventional science, a limitation this investigation states plainly rather than obscuring, and his claims of ongoing contact with an advanced allied civilization actively monitoring and opposing the Draconian presence have never produced any piece of physical evidence beyond his own recorded statements. What researchers in this field point to is not Collier's testimony in isolation, but its position within a much larger and, in specific structural details, independently converging body of testimony. Abduction witnesses across decades of hypnotic regression sessions conducted by different researchers on different continents. Sleep paralysis experiencers describing an encountered presence identifying itself when specifically asked as originating from that same general region of northern sky. And now, laid beneath all of it, a genuine, peer-reviewed, mathematically demonstrable ancient Egyptian architectural alignment toward the exact star sitting at the heart of that constellation, constructed by a civilization already established in Part 1 and Part 5 of this investigation as saturated with serpent being reverence at the highest levels of its religious and political authority. A fair skeptical treatment of this proof has to acknowledge a real weakness in the modern testimony that the ancient astronomy does not share: inconsistency. Not every witness in the wider contactee and abduction literature who claims to have received information about extraterrestrial origin names Draco specifically. Some name other star systems entirely, most commonly Zeta Reticuli, in connection with the smaller gray-type entities rather than the reptilian type. And even among witnesses who do specifically name Draco, the level of detail varies considerably, with some naming the constellation broadly, and others, like Collier, providing far more specific and elaborate claimed detail about internal political structure and specific worlds within the system that cannot be cross-checked against any other independent source. Skeptics reasonably argue that once the name Alpha-Draconian entered general conspiracy culture, likely reinforced by the genuinely striking Thuban pyramid alignment becoming more widely publicized through popular archaeoastronomy books from the 1970s onward, later witnesses undergoing hypnotic regression, already primed with the cultural association between reptilian beings and the word Draconian, would naturally and sincerely produce testimony naming that same constellation regardless of what, if anything, actually caused their underlying experience, which returns this proof directly to the same suggestibility concern raised against hypnotic regression testimony in the previous part. What this proof adds to the overall investigation, whatever conclusion any individual viewer ultimately draws from it, is a genuinely rare thing within this entire body of evidence, a piece of hard, measurable, professionally published astronomical data, the Thuban alignment, sitting directly underneath a body of independently gathered modern testimony that names the same star system as a point of origin, connecting the ancient world's oldest documented reverence for serpent beings directly to the specific patch of sky those same modern witnesses say the beings still come from. Whether that connection is a genuine thread running across 5,000 years of human history, or a coincidence of ancient astronomy later absorbed and echoed by a culture already saturated in the story, is exactly the kind of question this investigation has posed at the end of nearly every proof so far. The next proof turns from the sky back down to Earth and asks a considerably more uncomfortable question. If a hidden lineage connected to these beings has truly persisted across human history, where, specifically, is it alleged to be sitting today? And what does the surviving genealogical record say about the families that theorists claim carry it? Kingship descended from heaven, the bloodline theory. If the origin point described across the modern testimony in Part 7 is real, and if the underground hybridization program described in Part 3 genuinely produced generations of descendants carrying both human and non-human genetic material, then proponents of the Alpha-Draconian theory argue there is a specific, testable historical prediction that follows from those two claims combined. Somewhere in the historical record, a lineage would exist that understood itself, explicitly and self-consciously, as descended not from ordinary human ancestors, but from beings who came down from the sky, and that lineage would have every reason to maintain and protect its continuity across generations by consolidating power rather than dispersing it. This is the foundation of what researchers in this field call the bloodline theory. And unlike several of the earlier proofs in this investigation, its starting point is not folklore reconstructed after the fact. It is one of the oldest surviving administrative documents in human history, and it says, in its own opening line, exactly what the theory claims it should say. The Sumerian King List, a document surviving in multiple cuneiform copies, dating from roughly 2100 BCE onward and compiled from source material considerably older, is one of the foundational texts of ancient Mesopotamian scholarship, listing the succession of kings believed to have ruled the region across an enormous span of time. Its opening line, translated consistently across every major academic edition of the text, reads, "After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in the city of Eridu." The document then lists a sequence of kings said to have reigned before a great flood, each credited with reign lengths of tens of thousands of years, figures no mainstream historian treats as literal, generally interpreted instead as a scribal convention meant to convey the vast, sacred antiquity of the earliest rulers, rather than an accurate regnal record. What matters for this proof is not the specific numbers, which few researchers on any side of this debate take literally, but the document's own explicit, unambiguous framing, the institution of kingship itself. The very authority to rule other human beings is described as a thing that descended, arriving from somewhere else, rather than a thing that emerged organically from within early human society itself. This is not a later theorist's interpretation imposed onto an ambiguous ancient text. It is the first sentence of one of the oldest political documents human beings have ever produced. The author most associated with tracing this claimed descended authority forward through recorded history into the present day is Fritz Springmeier, whose 1995 book, Bloodlines of the Illuminati, argues that a specific number of interconnected aristocratic and financial family lines maintained continuous, deliberate control over major world events across centuries through strategic intermarriage, financial coordination, and membership in overlapping secret societies, tracing this claimed continuity conceptually back to the same non-human descended authority described in the Sumerian material. Springmeier's specific methodology and the specific families his book names in detail remain highly controversial and are not independently verified by any historian working outside this specific research tradition, and this investigation is not going to reproduce the detailed family-by-family claims his book makes for a reason that deserves to be stated to you directly and honestly, rather than glossed over. This particular branch of the Alpha-Draconian theory carries a documented history of overlap with a much older and considerably more dangerous conspiracy tradition, and any responsible account of this evidence has an obligation to say so plainly. Historians and researchers who study conspiracy theory as a cultural phenomenon have pointed out, repeatedly and across decades, that claims describing a small number of secretive, blood-connected families covertly controlling global finance and world governments echo the structure, almost point for point, of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a document fabricated by Russian secret police in the early 20th century that falsely purported to reveal a Jewish plan for world domination and which was subsequently used, and continues to be used today, to justify real, documented, violent anti-Semitic persecution across multiple countries and multiple decades. Journalists and researchers examining the modern reptilian bloodline theory, including some writing from within the broader alternative research and paranormal community itself, have noted that whenever this specific strand of the theory moves from the abstract ancient claim of divinely descended kingship toward naming specific modern family names, it disproportionately and repeatedly lands on the same families long targeted by that older anti-Semitic tradition, describing them in terms of secretive blood purity and hidden global financial control that are functionally identical to the older forgery, with the word reptilian substituted for the older, explicitly ethnic framing. David Icke, whose earlier work is examined throughout this investigation, has stated publicly and repeatedly that his own reptilian bloodline claims refer to an actual non-human species and are not intended as commentary on any human ethnic or religious group, and it would be inaccurate and unfair to simply assert that every researcher working in this specific area holds anti-Semitic views, or that most do. But responsible treatment of this proof requires acknowledging, without softening it, that this specific strand of the theory has functioned in practice for a meaningful portion of its real-world circulation, and among a meaningful portion of the audience it has reached, as a modern vehicle carrying a much older and thoroughly discredited form of hatred forward under new packaging, and that this history is precisely why this investigation is not going to name specific modern families in connection with this claim, regardless of what any individual book on this subject alleges. Set the family name level allegations aside, and a more modest and considerably more verifiable version of the underlying structural claim remains, one grounded in genuinely documented history rather than unverified allegation. European royal houses did, as a matter of well-established historical record with no conspiratorial interpretation required, practice sustained and deliberate intermarriage across national and generational lines for many centuries, driven by conventional and thoroughly documented political motives, consolidating territorial claims, securing alliances, and maintaining what royal families themselves openly termed blood purity within the aristocratic class, a term used in genuine historical documents describing royal marriage policy without any non-human implication whatsoever. This practice produced well-documented and scientifically verified consequences, most famously the spread of hemophilia through the intermarried royal houses of Russia, Spain, and the United Kingdom, following its introduction into the lineage through Britain's Queen Victoria, a medically confirmed genetic outcome of exactly the kind of close, repeated intermarriage across a closed aristocratic pool that bloodline theorists point to as circumstantial evidence of a lineage being deliberately kept separate from the wider human population across many generations. Mainstream historians offer a complete and sufficient explanation for this pattern that requires no non-human involvement at all. Royal intermarriage was a rational, well-documented political strategy pursued by ordinary human beings protecting ordinary human political and territorial interests, and its genetic consequences are the unremarkable, thoroughly studied result of reduced genetic diversity within any sufficiently closed breeding population, royal or otherwise. Researchers in this field do not generally dispute that mainstream explanation as far as it goes. They argue instead that the practice itself, whatever its stated political motive, would look identical from the outside, whether its true underlying purpose was ordinary political consolidation or the deliberate preservation of a specific inherited lineage, meaning the historical record of royal intermarriage is fully consistent with either explanation and cannot, on its own, rule either one out. Freemasonry and other fraternal secret societies enter this proof again here, building on the architectural symbolism examined in Part 5, but from a different angle. Not what these organizations built, but how they are alleged to function as a mechanism. Proponents of the bloodline theory argue that an organization built around tiered secrecy, initiation, oaths, and internal hierarchy is structurally well-suited to serve as a discrete network through which individuals connected to a hidden lineage could recognize, support, and advance one another across generations without ever requiring any public acknowledgement of the underlying purpose, using the organization's legitimate public charitable and social functions as effective cover. It is important, for balance, to state plainly what is also true. Freemasonry is an enormous global organization numbering in the millions of members across its history, the overwhelming majority of whom are, and have always been, ordinary working and middle-class men with no political power, no aristocratic connection, and no access to any hidden agenda whatsoever. joining primarily for the fraternal, charitable, and social community the organization genuinely and openly provides, a fact that sits uncomfortably alongside any claim that the organization as a whole functions as a global bloodline network, even if researchers in this field argue that a small, unrepresentative faction operating within the organization's highest and least publicly documented internal grades could theoretically use the broader membership's ordinary, innocent activity as effective camouflage. What this proof leaves behind, weighing its stronger and weaker elements honestly against one another, is a genuine and undisputed ancient document that explicitly frames the origin of human political authority as something that descended rather than something that arose, a well-documented historical practice of closed aristocratic intermarriage whose stated motives are fully explainable in ordinary human terms, but whose outward pattern remains equally consistent with a hidden lineage preservation purpose and a specific, named family-level version of the claim that this investigation has deliberately declined to repeat because of its well-documented and serious history of overlap with older, discredited, and genuinely harmful conspiracy traditions that this investigation has no interest in giving further life to. The next proof moves away from lineage and genealogy entirely, back to the kind of evidence a viewer can actually look at directly: the photographs, videos, and captured visual material that researchers in this field have spent decades collecting, analyzing frame by frame, and arguing over examined next. On film, photographic evidence, and the forensics of a hoax. Testimony, no matter how consistent across witnesses who never met each other, remains testimony, filtered through memory, emotion, and the limits of human perception. The ninth proof in this investigation moves to something that can, at least in principle, be examined directly: photographs, film, and video, captured not through hypnotic regression or decades-old recollection, but in the moment on physical or digital media that can be analyzed frame by frame, checked against metadata, and in several major cases, definitively proven true or false through conventional forensic methods rather than argument alone. This proof cuts both ways more sharply than any other in this investigation, because it is the category of evidence most vulnerable to deliberate hoaxing, and also the category most capable of actually resolving a specific claim once and for all when the analysis is done properly. The most heavily documented modern case of an alleged photographed reptilian encounter in American folklore comes from Bishopville, South Carolina, in the summer of 1988. A 17-year-old named Christopher Davis reported that while changing a flat tire on a rural road bordering scape or swamp shortly after 2 in the morning, he saw a large, bipedal, green-skinned creature with red eyes running toward his car from the tree line, and that after he fled, the creature climbed onto the vehicle and damaged the roof and side mirror before he managed to drive away. What separates this case from the large majority of similar reports is the amount of independent, physical, and institutionally documented corroboration it generated within days. Davis reported the incident to the Lee County Sheriff's Department, which treated the report seriously enough to open a formal investigation, and Davis filed an insurance claim for the vehicle damage, creating a contemporaneous paper trail generated for entirely mundane, bureaucratic reasons rather than for any conspiracy research purpose. Within the following weeks, at least 2 other separate residents in the same rural area independently reported their own vehicles had sustained similar unexplained damage, and additional area residents came forward describing their own sightings of a large, upright, reptilian-looking creature in the same general vicinity, none of whom, according to contemporaneous local newspaper coverage, had coordinated their accounts with Davis or with each other beforehand. Sheriff's investigators at the time publicly stated they could not identify a conventional animal responsible for the specific pattern of damage to Davis's vehicle, though they also never ruled out a large bear, an animal known to be present in the region and capable of producing comparable structural damage to a parked car through ordinary foraging or startled behavior, which remains the leading conventional explanation offered by wildlife biologists who have reviewed the case, alongside the possibility of an elaborate juvenile hoax, given Davis's age at the time of the report and the absence of any surviving physical evidence beyond the vehicle damage itself, which was not preserved for later forensic re-examination. A separate and older reptilian humanoid case comes from the town of Loveland, Ohio, where reports stretching back to 1955 describe a frog-like or lizard-like bipedal creature, roughly 3 to 4 feet tall, encountered along the banks of the Miami River, with the most widely cited sighting occurring in 1972 when a police officer on night patrol reported seeing a similar creature crouched at the roadside before it fled back toward the riverbank, a report significant primarily because it came from a law enforcement officer on duty, adding a layer of professional credibility similar in kind, though considerably smaller in scale, to the military testimony examined in Part 4. No photograph or physical evidence from either the 1955 or 1972 Loveland reports has ever surfaced, and the leading conventional explanation offered by herpetologists who have reviewed the case description is a large, escaped, or native iguana or similar reptile observed under poor nighttime lighting conditions by a witness whose perception was shaped by prior exposure to local frogman folklore already circulating in the area by the time of the later sighting, an explanation the original 1972 officer publicly rejected in later interviews, maintaining his account throughout his life. The single most important case study in this entire proof, because it demonstrates definitively what rigorous forensic film analysis can accomplish when applied to alleged non-human evidence, is not a reptilian case at all, but it establishes the methodology researchers in this field now apply to every subsequent piece of photographic and video material, reptilian or otherwise, and belongs in this investigation for that reason. In 1995, a British video entrepreneur named Ray Santilli released black and white film footage he claimed had been purchased from a retired military cameraman, purporting to show a genuine autopsy performed on a recovered non-human body following the 1947 Roswell incident. The footage was broadcast internationally, including on American network television, and generated enormous public attention and genuine scientific interest. What followed over the next decade is one of the best documented forensic debunking processes in this entire field. Special effects artists, including professionals with direct experience in medical prop and prosthetic construction, examined the footage frame by frame and identified specific, technically precise inconsistencies. The movement and viscosity of fluids handled during the simulated autopsy did not match the physical properties of genuine biological tissue and instead matched known behavior of common prop materials such as sheep intestine and chicken entrails. Camera framing repeatedly and conveniently obscured the most anatomically critical moments in a pattern more consistent with concealing a limited budget prop's construction seams than with an unplanned, genuine historical document. And the film stock and camera equipment used showed period inconsistencies that independent film historians were able to date more precisely than the footage's claimed 1947 origin. Faced with this accumulating forensic case, Santilli acknowledged in 2006 that the footage was, in his own description, a reconstruction, claiming he had obtained a small number of genuine but severely deteriorated original frames and had recreated the rest using props and actors to preserve what he described as the substance of what he had originally seen. An explanation forensic analysts and the wider research community have treated with significant additional skepticism given how thoroughly the entire visible sequence matched known prop and prosthetic construction rather than showing any identifiable transition between genuine and reconstructed material. The Santilli case established the specific forensic toolkit researchers in this field on both the believing and skeptical sides now apply to every viral photograph or video claiming to show a reptilian entity, frame-by-frame examination for prop seams, unnatural material behavior, and lighting inconsistencies between the alleged subject and its claimed environment. Digital metadata analysis, examining a photograph or video file's embedded technical data for the specific camera model, timestamp, and editing software history, which frequently reveals a claimed decades-old photograph was in fact captured or last modified using software that did not exist until years after its claimed origin. And reverse image search, a technique that has, in a meaningful number of viral reptilian photograph cases circulated across social media over the past 15 years, successfully traced the image back to its actual mundane source, most commonly a professional theatrical or Halloween prosthetic makeup photograph, a still frame lifted from a low-budget horror film, or a promotional image for a haunted attraction, stripped of its original context and recirculated with a new, false claim of authenticity attached. Researchers who apply this toolkit rigorously have successfully identified and publicly debunked a substantial majority of the reptilian photographs and videos that achieve viral circulation, a track record skeptics point to as strong evidence that hoaxing, rather than genuine encounter, accounts for the overwhelming majority of this specific category of claimed evidence. Not every case submitted to this proof has been resolved so cleanly, and honesty requires stating that too. A smaller category of material, most commonly still images or short video clips captured on motion-triggered wildlife trail cameras deployed by hunters and researchers in remote forested areas primarily to monitor deer and other game animals, has occasionally produced anomalous humanoid shapes that neither wildlife biologists nor forensic photo analysts have been able to conclusively identify as a known animal, a hoax, or a camera malfunction, though the base rate of ordinary explanation remains extremely high in this category as well. A bear standing upright on its hind legs, a deer suffering from mange, or a skin condition producing an unnatural silhouette, double exposure, or motion blur artifacts common to older trail camera models, or simple pareidolia applied by a viewer already primed to look for a humanoid shape in an ambiguous, low-resolution nighttime image, an effect that operates on trail camera photographs in essentially the same psychological way it operates on the classical architecture discussed in Part 5. What remains, after the large majority of viral material is filtered out through rigorous forensic analysis, is a genuinely small residue of cases, concentrated heavily in the Scape-Ore Swamp and Loveland material examined at the start of this proof, where a contemporaneous institutional record exists, filed for mundane bureaucratic reasons at the time, rather than reconstructed decades later for an audience already primed to believe, and where no conventional animal, hoax, or camera artifact has ever been definitively and universally agreed upon as the full explanation. Photographic and video evidence, more than any other category examined in this investigation, rewards patience and rigorous method over quick belief or quick dismissal, and the honest conclusion of this proof reflects that the overwhelming majority of circulated reptilian photographic and video material collapses under direct forensic scrutiny, exactly as the Santilli footage did, and any responsible viewer should treat newly circulating viral material with exactly that level of default skepticism until it has been examined the same way. A small number of older, institutionally documented cases have not collapsed in the same way and remain, more than 3 decades later, formally unresolved rather than formally explained. The next proof leaves photographic evidence behind and returns to where this investigation is strongest: the ordinary, unpublicized, day-to-day sighting reports gathered from modern witnesses with no book deal, no conference circuit, and in the large majority of cases, no desire to be believed by anyone beyond the people they told at the time, examined next. Ordinary witnesses, the modern sighting record. Every witness examined so far in this investigation has occupied an unusual position: a military officer with a career and a security clearance on the line, an author with books to sell, a self-described contactee building a public following, a shaman preserving a sacred oral tradition. Each of them had something at stake in being believed, or at minimum something that sets them apart from an ordinary person going about an ordinary day. The 10th and final proof in this investigation is built on a different, and in some ways, more difficult to dismiss category of source: the largely unpublicized, day-to-day sighting reports filed by ordinary people with no book deal, no conference invitation, and in the overwhelming majority of cases, no public visibility at all beyond a case number in a database most of the public has never heard of. That database, and the organization behind it, is worth understanding directly: the Mutual UFO Network, generally known by its acronym MUFON, was founded in 1969 and remains the largest and longest continuously operating civilian organization in the world dedicated to collecting, cataloging, and field investigating reports of anomalous aerial and, in a smaller but consistent proportion of cases, entity encounters submitted directly by members of the public. MUFON maintains a standardized intake form and a network of trained volunteer field investigators who follow up on submitted reports, and it uses a classification system for entity and craft encounters originally developed by the astronomer J. Allen Hynek, who served for years as the scientific consultant to the United States Air Force's official investigative program, Project Blue Book, before becoming an outspoken advocate for more rigorous scientific study of the phenomenon after leaving that role. Hynek's classification scale, still in standard use today, ranges from a close encounter of the first kind, a visual sighting of an unidentified object with no other interaction, through progressively more direct categories culminating in a close encounter of the third kind, involving the observed presence of an actual occupant or entity associated with the object. Among the tens of thousands of reports MUFON has cataloged since its founding, the large majority describe craft sightings with no entity observed at all, but a consistent smaller minority describe a close encounter of the third kind, specifically involving a humanoid figure, and within that already narrower category, a further identifiable subset, spread across every decade of the database and every region of the country, specifically describes the figure using explicitly reptilian language, scaled or leathery skin, a tail, a low crouched or powerfully built stance, and, recurring yet again, the same vertically slitted eyes documented independently across Part 2, Part 6, and now this final category of ordinary unpublicized citizen reporting. One location has generated a more sustained and institutionally documented pattern of anomalous sighting reports, including specifically reptilian and other unusual animal-like entity descriptions, than almost anywhere else in the modern record. A ranch property in the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah, purchased in 1996 by the aerospace entrepreneur Robert Bigelow specifically because of decades of prior anomalous reports from the property and its surrounding area, and studied afterward through Bigelow's own privately funded research organization, the National Institute for Discovery Science. The property, widely known today by its unofficial nickname Skinwalker Ranch, generated documented reports, gathered by Bigelow's hired research staff using scientific instrumentation rather than casual witness recollection, of large, powerfully built, animal-like entities on the property, described by multiple independent staff members across different years as bearing reptilian or wolf-like characteristics depending on the specific encounter, alongside a wide range of other reported anomalies, including unexplained electromagnetic readings, cattle mutilations matching the pattern described in Part 3, and structures that researchers reported disappearing and reappearing without explanation. What separates the Skinwalker Ranch material from most other entries in this proof is that it was gathered under something closer to controlled scientific conditions by paid staff using recording equipment on a single, continuously monitored property rather than compiled from scattered, unconnected public submissions, a distinction that later attracted the interest of the Pentagon's own Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a real, formally acknowledged Department of Defense initiative active from 2007 to 2012, which contracted with a Bigelow-associated research firm and reportedly examined material connected to the ranch as part of its broader mandate studying unidentified aerial phenomena, a connection that has since been the subject of extensive mainstream press coverage and a multi-season History Channel documentary series examining the property in detail. Beyond Skinwalker Ranch, researchers who study the broader modern sighting record have identified a recurring geographic and environmental pattern across otherwise unconnected reptilian entity reports submitted independently to MUFON and similar organizations over the past several decades, a disproportionate concentration of reports near high-voltage electrical transmission infrastructure, isolated cave systems and mine shafts, and, in more urbanized reports, storm drain and utility tunnel networks beneath cities, an environmental pattern that echoes and researchers argue reinforces the underground and infrastructure adjacent testimony examined earlier in this investigation, from the Dulce facility claims in Part 3 to the Denver Airport tunnel speculation touched on in Part 5. This same power infrastructure association is not unique to reptilian reports. It has been separately and independently documented in the cryptid research literature surrounding the Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, West Virginia during 1966 and 1967. A wave of encounters that occurred in close geographic association with an abandoned munitions storage facility and its associated high-voltage infrastructure, leading some researchers across multiple unrelated anomalous entity fields to propose, without firm scientific consensus, that unusually high ambient electromagnetic activity may play some role in either attracting genuinely present anomalous phenomena or in producing the kind of sensory disturbance capable of generating vivid, convincing, subjective encounters in otherwise reliable witnesses. A hypothesis that remains speculative on both the believing and skeptical sides of this research, but that at least has the virtue of being drawn from a real, independently measurable environmental variable rather than pure narrative. A serious statistical concern has to be addressed directly in this final proof, because it applies with particular force to any argument built on a rising volume of citizen-submitted reports. The number of entity encounter reports submitted to organizations like MUFON has increased substantially since the organization's founding, and especially sharply since the widespread adoption of the internet, and later, smartphones made both the act of witnessing something unusual more likely to be recorded, and the act of reporting it dramatically easier and more socially comfortable than it was for a witness in 1969 facing a mailed paper form and the very real social risk of being labeled unstable by their own community. Sociologists who study this field point out that a rising volume of reports over time is fully explainable through this changing reporting environment alone, without requiring any actual increase in the underlying rate of genuine encounters, and separately identify a well-documented pattern of regional sighting clusters that closely track local media coverage of an initial widely publicized report, a social contagion effect observed clearly during the original 1966 Point Pleasant Mothman wave and replicated in numerous smaller sighting clusters since, in which an initial report, once locally publicized, appears to prime an entire community to interpret ambiguous nighttime experiences, an owl in flight, a neighbor's large dog, an unfamiliar shadow, through the specific narrative lens the initial report established, producing a genuine and sincere but ultimately narrative-driven wave of subsequent reports, rather than a wave of independent, unrelated, genuine encounters. Researchers in this field who take the sighting record seriously do not generally dispute that this contagion effect is real and does inflate report volume during and immediately after a well-publicized case. They argue instead that it cannot fully account for the geographically dispersed, decades-spanning, and often entirely unpublicized individual reports, scattered continuously throughout the MUFON database in years and regions, with no preceding local media wave to have primed the witness at all. Cases where an ordinary person with no known prior exposure to reptilian entity folklore filed a report describing the same narrow, specific physical details independently arrived at by thousands of other witnesses before them. The same convergence problem this investigation has now returned to at the close of nearly every proof it has examined. That is, in the end, the honest shape of the entire modern sighting record, a real, large, and continuously growing body of citizen testimony, inflated to an unknown but almost certainly meaningful degree by internet-era reporting ease and well-documented social contagion effects, sitting on top of a smaller, harder-to-dismiss residue of geographically dispersed, unpublicized, individually filed reports describing the same narrow physical details independently across decades, gathered by an organization using a formal scientific classification system originally developed by a credentialed astronomer who spent years working for the United States government's own official investigative body. 10 separate proofs have now been laid out across this investigation, from 5,000-year-old cuneiform tablets to a Utah ranch under Pentagon-adjacent scientific study. None of them, examined individually and in isolation, constitutes definitive scientific proof, and this investigation has said so plainly at the end of every single one. What remains is to step back from the individual pieces of evidence entirely and give the skeptical case its own full and complete hearing on its own terms, gathering together the strongest counter-arguments raised throughout this investigation into a single, unified challenge to everything presented so far before this investigation reaches its own final conclusion. The case against giving skepticism its full hearing. Every proof in this investigation has included its counter-argument, presented in the same breath as the claim it challenges. That approach has a real cost. Scattered across 10 separate parts, the skeptical case never gets to stand on its own, built up point by point into the single unified position it actually represents in the minds of the scientists, historians, and researchers who hold it. This part corrects that. Everything that follows is the strongest version of the case against the Alpha-Draconian theory gathered into one place, and it deserves to be heard with the same seriousness this investigation has given every claim that came before it. Begin with the foundation the entire investigation was built on, the worldwide recurrence of serpent and dragon mythology across unconnected ancient cultures examined in Part 1. Evolutionary biologists have a specific, published, peer-reviewed explanation for this pattern that requires no contact between civilizations and no real encounter with any actual being at all. The primatologist Lynn Isbell published a formal scientific hypothesis in 2006, now widely referred to as snake detection theory, proposing that the specific neural architecture of the primate visual system, including structures shared by humans and our closest evolutionary relatives, developed under sustained selective pressure from millions of years of coexistence with venomous snakes long before the emergence of modern humans at all. Isbell's research demonstrates that primate brains, including human brains, detect snake-like shapes faster and more reliably than almost any other visual category tested, and that this detection triggers a measurably stronger fear response than equivalent non-snake stimuli, an instinctive bias present in human infants before they are old enough to have learned it culturally. If every human being on Earth is born with this specific hardwired elevated sensitivity to serpentine shape and threat, evolutionary psychologists argue, it becomes entirely unremarkable rather than a suspicious coincidence that culture after culture, working independently, built elaborate mythology around the one category of danger every human brain is already pre-tuned to fear more than any other. The psychiatrist Carl Jung offered a complementary explanation from an entirely different academic direction decades earlier, proposing that human beings inherit not specific memories, but shared symbolic structures he called archetypes, patterns of imagery that recur across unconnected cultures because they emerge from a common underlying human psychology rather than from any shared historical event. Jung specifically identified the serpent or dragon as one of the clearest examples of a universal archetype representing across the cultures he studied a consistent psychological role. Primal danger, hidden knowledge, and the boundary between civilization and chaos, exactly the thematic role the serpent plays in the Sumerian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, Mesoamerican, African, Australian, and European material examined in Part 1. Under Jung's framework, independently invented, remarkably similar serpent mythology across the ancient world is not merely explainable. It is the expected and predicted outcome of a shared human psychology encountering the same category of instinctive fear identified by Isbell's later biological research, giving the mythological convergence at the heart of this investigation's first proof two separate, independently developed, empirically grounded academic explanations that require no non-human contact whatsoever. The pattern recognition problem raised repeatedly throughout this investigation, from the architectural symbolism in Part 5 to the trail camera images in Part 9, has its own formal name and its own body of research behind it. The cognitive phenomenon of finding meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous data is termed apophenia, and its specific application to perceiving faces or figures in ambiguous visual noise is called pareidolia, both well-established and extensively studied concepts in cognitive psychology. The science writer and skeptic magazine publisher Michael Shermer has argued extensively, drawing on this same body of research, that human pattern detection evolved under conditions where the cost of a false positive, mistaking a random shadow for a predator, was trivial, while the cost of a false negative, mistaking a genuine predator for a random shadow, could be fatal, meaning natural selection would be expected to favor a cognitive system that errs strongly towards seeing threatening patterns even where none exist, a bias Shermer terms patternicity. Applied across this investigation, the argument is direct. A human visual and cognitive system already biased towards seeing serpentine threats, examining a Bernini colonnade, a low-resolution trail camera photograph, or a single frame of interlaced 1990s broadcast video will reliably find the pattern it is primed to look for. Not because the pattern is objectively present in the data, but because the cognitive system doing the looking is not a neutral instrument, and once a specific theory has told a viewer what to look for, ambiguous visual information becomes remarkably cooperative at supplying it. A more technical criticism, and one of the most serious raised against this entire field, comes not from biology or psychology, but from the philosophy of science itself. The philosopher Karl Popper proposed, in a body of work now foundational to how modern science distinguishes a genuine scientific claim from a pseudoscientific one, that a claim only qualifies as scientific if it is falsifiable, meaning there must exist some conceivable observation or experiment capable of proving the claim false, and that a theory structured so that every possible piece of contrary evidence can be absorbed and reinterpreted as further confirmation rather than as a challenge, has stepped outside the boundaries of testable science entirely. Applied directly to this investigation, the criticism lands with real force. The complete absence of any verified underground facility, despite decades of searching, examined honestly in Part 3, is absorbed by the theory as evidence of the being's superior concealment technology rather than evidence against their existence. The complete absence of any independently authenticated physical specimen, examined across Part 6 and Part 9, is absorbed as evidence of a successful, deliberate cover-up rather than evidence the specimens do not exist. The inconsistency between different contactees regarding the specific claimed star of origin, noted honestly in Part 7, is available to be explained away as differing levels of access or deliberate disinformation planted among genuine contactees, rather than treated as evidence that the underlying claims are not describing a single consistent external reality at all. A theory capable of converting every single piece of potential disconfirming evidence into further proof of its own correctness. Popper's framework argues, cannot in principle ever be shown to be false by any observation, and a claim that cannot in principle be falsified is not a claim science has the tools to evaluate as true, regardless of how much testimony accumulates in its favor. The financial and reputational structure surrounding this field also deserves direct, unflinching examination because it is rarely given the weight it deserves within the community that produces this testimony. Every major figure examined across Parts 3, 4, 6, and 7 of this investigation who achieved public visibility for their claims did so, at least in part, through channels that directly rewarded continued and often escalating testimony, book sales, paid conference appearances, and in the most recent and explicit example, Corey Good's subscription-based content platform, a business model that generates revenue in direct proportion to the volume and novelty of ongoing claim testimony, creating a structural incentive entirely independent of any individual's sincerity for claims to expand rather than stabilize over time. This is not, by itself, proof that any specific individual examined in this investigation fabricated their testimony for profit. Sincere believers can and do build careers around genuinely held convictions in every field of human endeavor. But an honest accounting of the skeptical case has to note that the specific economic structure surrounding this community rewards exactly the pattern of continually escalating, ever more elaborate testimony that critics observe within it, making it difficult to fully separate genuine, evolving personal conviction from the ordinary economic pressure toward audience retention that governs any career built on public storytelling. Closely related is what researchers who study conspiracy communities call the citation network problem, and it directly undermines the single strongest seeming piece of evidence this investigation has returned to again and again: the apparent independent convergence of separate witnesses on the same specific details. When that convergence is traced carefully rather than simply asserted, a considerable portion of it collapses into a much smaller number of original sources repeated and amplified through an interconnected media ecosystem rather than genuinely independent testimony. William Cooper's 1991 book reached a mass audience years before most of the other testimony examined in this investigation became public, and the specific reptilian dominant, gray subordinate hierarchy his book popularized had over a decade to circulate through the same conference circuits, the same publishing houses, and increasingly the same online forums before Stone's formal testimony, before Ickey's synthesis, and well over 2 decades before Good's public emergence, all of whom moved within an overlapping community of researchers who read each other's books, appeared at each other's conferences, and cited each other's work as corroboration, a pattern that looks from the outside like dozens of unconnected witnesses independently arriving at the same conclusion can, on closer sociological examination, resemble something closer to a single influential narrative framework established early and repeated with variation by a relatively small and tightly interconnected community of researchers and witnesses who have had continuous, direct exposure to each other's work for decades, a dynamic well documented in the sociology of belief communities more broadly and not unique to this specific field. All of this converges on what may be the single most decisive gap in the entire case examined across this investigation, and it deserves to close out the skeptical argument because no other objection carries its weight. Despite thousands of claimed encounters across Part 6, an alleged multi-decade underground genetic program examined in Part 3, and repeated claims of physical injury, physical contact, and even claimed genetic hybridization passed down through human family lines examined in Part 8, not one single physical sample, hair, tissue, blood, or otherwise, has ever been submitted to an accredited, independent genetics laboratory and returned a result identifying material inconsistent with known terrestrial life. This stands in direct and instructive contrast to how comparable claims in the adjacent field of cryptozoology have actually been tested when physical material was available. The geneticist Brian Sykes led a formal academic research effort, the Oxford-Lausanne Collateral Hominid Project, published in 2014, that collected and genetically sequenced dozens of hair samples submitted from around the world by believers as physical evidence of Bigfoot and Yeti populations, and definitively identified every single sample as belonging to known, already cataloged species, including bears, wolves, cows, and in several cases, humans, resolving those specific physical claims with the same kind of clean, replicable, independently verifiable scientific method that has never once been applied to a reptilian-linked sample, for the simple reason that no reptilian-linked sample has ever been made available for testing at all. Skeptics argue this asymmetry is the whole case in miniature. An adjacent, comparably fringe field produced physical material, submitted it to real science, and received a real, falsifiable, and ultimately negative answer, while this field, across every proof examined in this investigation, has produced testimony, symbolism, and pattern, but never once the one category of evidence capable of settling the matter beyond argument. Laid against the 10 proofs examined earlier in this investigation, the skeptical case does not need to defeat each proof individually to be taken seriously, because it does not claim to. It claims something more modest and, its proponents argue, more scientifically disciplined, that human beings arrive already equipped with an evolved sensitivity to serpentine threat, an evolved tendency to find confirming patterns in ambiguous data, and a well-documented capacity to build sincere, entire self-reinforcing belief communities around unfalsifiable claims, and that these three ordinary, well-established features of human psychology, operating continuously across 5,000 years of storytelling and 80 years of modern testimony, are fully sufficient to produce everything this investigation has presented without requiring a single actual reptilian being to have ever existed at all. That is the strongest form of the case against. Stated plainly and without the softening this investigation has applied to it everywhere else. What remains is to set that case directly beside the 10 proofs it answers, and let this investigation reach the only honest conclusion available to it. The verdict, what the evidence actually supports. This investigation opened with a pattern buried in the oldest stories human beings have ever told. It closes here with that same pattern laid out in full, weighed against the strongest possible case that it means nothing at all, and an honest reckoning with what actually survives that weighing. 10 proofs were presented, a worldwide mythology of serpent beings arising independently across civilizations with no verified contact between them, describing creators, teachers, and rulers capable of assuming human shape. A modern testimony phenomenon describing that same disguise briefly failing, caught in blurred video and remembered in-person encounters, converging on the same narrow set of physical details across 2 decades and multiple continents. Public testimony, much of it from named engineers, soldiers, and intelligence officers who risked their careers and reputations, describing an underground presence and a genetic program operating beneath the American Southwest. Ancient religious architecture and modern civic monuments built by hands that left behind a documented, if disputed, symbolic language pointing back toward exactly the beings described in the oldest texts. A body of first-person abduction testimony taken seriously by credentialed Harvard psychiatry alongside its serious and well-documented psychiatric counter-explanation. A genuine, peer-reviewed, mathematically demonstrable ancient Egyptian architectural alignment toward a star at the heart of the same constellation modern witnesses, independently and without access to that archaeoastronomy, keep naming as a point of origin. A 4,000-year-old administrative document that opens by describing human political authority as a thing that descended from somewhere else. A photographic and video record mostly resolved by rigorous forensic method and a small residue that has not been. And an ordinary, unglamorous, still-growing body of citizen sighting reports, filed under a scientific classification system built by a government-employed astronomer, describing the same physical details as every category of testimony that came before it. And then, in full, the case against all of it. A hardwired evolutionary sensitivity to serpentine threat, present in the human brain before any culture or story ever touched it. A documented cognitive tendency to find confirming patterns in ambiguous noise, operating identically whether the noise is a Renaissance colonnade or a blurry frame of 1990s broadcast video. A philosophical framework taken from the heart of how modern science defines itself, arguing that a theory able to absorb every possible piece of contrary evidence as further proof of its own correctness has placed itself permanently beyond the reach of any test that could ever prove it wrong. A financial and social structure that rewards escalating testimony over stable, quiet conviction. A citation network dense enough that testimony appearing independently at first glance traces back, on closer inspection, to a much smaller number of original sources, amplified through decades of shared conferences and shared audiences. And beneath all of it, one gap large enough to carry the whole skeptical case on its own. Across 80 years of claimed contact and thousands of individual testimonies, not one single physical sample has ever been placed in the hands of an accredited laboratory and returned an answer that could not be explained by known terrestrial biology in a scientific era capable of resolving that exact question about that exact category of claim for a comparable cryptid field in a single published study. What can honestly be said, sitting with both of those cases at once, rather than choosing between them for the sake of a tidy ending, is this. The weakest material examined across this investigation is genuinely weak, and this script has not pretended otherwise at any point along the way. Pseudonymous testimony that can never be verified. A bloodline theory whose family-level claims this investigation deliberately declined to repeat because of their documented history of overlap with older and more dangerous conspiracy traditions, and a photographic record where the majority of viral material collapses the moment anyone applies the same forensic method that dismantled the 1995 Santilli footage frame by frame. Anyone presenting this subject to you as a closed case in either direction is leaving material out. The strongest material, by contrast, does not rest on any single witness's word at all, and that distinction matters more than any other conclusion this investigation can offer. The Sumerian king list's opening line was carved by people who had no reason to be building a modern conspiracy theory and no audience beyond their own contemporaries to convince. The alignment of the Great Pyramid's descending passage toward Thuban is a measurable geometric fact, independently calculable by anyone with the pyramid's coordinates and a working knowledge of precession, regardless of what they believe about aliens. The vehicle damage in Bishopville, South Carolina, was documented in an insurance claim filed for the mundane purpose of getting a car repaired, years before anyone involved had any reason to think the story would still be discussed decades later. These pieces of evidence do not require anyone to trust a witness's memory or a hypnotist's methodology. They simply exist, independent of belief, and they are the reason this specific theory, alone among the vast catalog of modern conspiracy claims, keeps surviving contact with genuine historical and scientific scrutiny in a way that far more claims from the same broader research tradition simply do not. This investigation is not going to hand you a verdict, and it would be dishonest to pretend that withholding one is a failure of nerve, rather than the only defensible position available after weighing the material fairly. No living researcher on either side of this question currently possesses the one piece of evidence that would actually settle it, a verified physical specimen, and until that changes, every conclusion on offer, including the confident dismissals as much as the confident convictions, is an inference built from incomplete information rather than a demonstrated fact. What this investigation can tell you, honestly, is where the burden now sits. It sits with the 10 proofs to produce, at long last, the one category of evidence that has eluded them for 80 years. And it sits with the skeptical case to explain, with the same rigor it applies everywhere else, why a threat detection instinct evolved for snakes in the grass would organize itself independently across 8 unconnected ancient civilizations into kings, cities, hierarchies, and a single recurring claim of a home in the northern sky, rather than simply into fear. Somewhere above the northern hemisphere tonight, whether or not you ever look up to see it, Draco is still there, coiled across the pole, the way it has been every clear night since before the pyramids had a name, exactly where it was the night an Egyptian priest first aligned a shaft of solid limestone toward it, and exactly where it was long before anyone had a reason to wonder why. The stories built around that patch of sky are not going anywhere. Neither is the question of what, if anything, first put them there. This investigation set out to lay both in front of you without flinching from either one, and that is where it leaves them. Not resolved, not dismissed, but finally, after 5,000 years, laid out fully side by side for you to decide what to do with the pattern now that you have seen the whole of it. The verdict, what the evidence actually supports. 11 parts ago, this investigation opened with a pattern buried in the oldest stories human beings have ever told. 10 proofs have been laid out since then, and a full, unflinching hearing has been given to the case that every one of those 10 proofs means nothing at all. What remains is the hardest and most honest part of any investigation of this kind, not simply repeating what has already been said, but actually weighing it, proof against rebuttal, fact against inference, in order to arrive at the most defensible position available, and being equally clear about where that position runs out and where genuine uncertainty begins. That is the task of this final part, and it deserves the same care given to every claim examined so far, which means it cannot be rushed, and it cannot simply restate 11 parts of material in miniature. It has to actually do the work of judgment. Start with the first proof, the worldwide mythology, because everything else in this investigation was built on top of it, Set against each other, the single strongest fact in that proof and the single strongest rebuttal against it are not actually in conflict with one another in the way a first viewing might suggest. The strongest fact is specificity. It is one thing for unconnected cultures to independently invent a dangerous serpent, and quite another for them to independently invent a serpent that teaches writing, founds royal bloodlines, organizes itself into underground cities with kings, and is capable of walking among humans in disguise. The strongest rebuttal, drawn from Isbell's snake detection research and Jung's archetype theory, explains the danger and the fear convincingly, but it explains the specific socio-political structure layered on top of that fear far less convincingly, and this is worth sitting with directly rather than passing over. An instinctive fear response is not, on its own, an obvious source for the idea of an underground kingdom with a monarchy and a capital city. That additional layer of detail is not biologically automatic in the way a startle reflex is. It is a constructed cultural elaboration, requiring imagination, narrative invention, and generational transmission. Exactly the kind of elaboration a genuinely inventive human mind is fully capable of producing without any external prompt at all. The honest position on this first proof, then, is that the base fear is fully and satisfyingly explained by evolutionary psychology, while the specific narrative architecture built on top of that fear remains a case where independent invention and inherited memory of a real event both remain live possibilities, neither one ruled out by the evidence as it currently stands. The second proof, the eye flash phenomenon, holds up less well under this kind of direct weighing than it might first appear to in isolation. The technical explanations available, interlacing artifacts, lighting reflections, compression errors, and genuine ophthalmological conditions like benign essential anisocoria are not merely plausible. They are individually documented, replicable, and sufficient on their own terms to account for the large majority of circulated video. What kept this proof alive across the investigation was the claim that the specific artifact produced was too consistent to be a coincidence of unrelated technical causes. Weighed carefully, that argument is weaker than it initially sounds, because human beings are not comparing thousands of clips against a truly random distribution of possible visual errors. They are comparing clips already selected out of a much larger and unremarked pool of ordinary broadcast footage, specifically because they resembled a story that was already culturally established by the time most of this footage began circulating widely in the mid-2000s, more than a decade after Cooper's book and William Cooper's own testimony had already introduced the reptilian hierarchy narrative into wider circulation. A selection effect this strong can produce apparent consistency in the output even from a genuinely inconsistent and independently random set of underlying technical causes, because clips that do not match the expected pattern are simply never flagged, saved, or shared in the first place. The in-person testimony carries more weight than the video does, precisely because it removes the technical artifact explanation entirely, but it introduces the older and, on balance, better supported explanation covered across the entire investigation: ordinary human memory and perception under conditions of high emotional arousal, a state in which visual misperception is well documented to increase substantially, even in witnesses with no prior belief in anything paranormal at all. The third proof, the underground base and hybrid program testimony, is where the case is weakest on physical grounds and strongest on narrative consistency, and those two facts have to be held together rather than allowed to cancel each other into a false middle position. No entrance, no facility, no ventilation shaft, and no construction record has ever been independently verified at Dulce, despite extensive amateur searching using ground-penetrating equipment over several decades. And this absence, over that much time, carries real evidentiary weight, rather than being a neutral non-finding, because a facility of the scale described would be expected to leave detectable secondary signatures even under determined secrecy. Weighed against that absence is Schneider's public testimony given under his real name and profession, and the earlier, independently developed hierarchy claim from Cooper, both of which converge with the Castello material on a strikingly similar internal structure. The honest reading is that narrative convergence among testimony that may share a common cultural and informational lineage is measurably weaker evidence than convergence among testimony that developed in true isolation. And Part 4 already established that Cooper's account had a decade of head start to shape the wider narrative before Schneider's public lectures began, meaning this proof's apparent independence is more fragile than it looks at first pass. The cattle mutilation phenomenon remains the most genuinely puzzling piece of this proof precisely because it generated a contemporaneous documentary record from parties, veterinarians, county sheriffs, agricultural extension offices, with no stake whatsoever in the wider conspiracy theory, and that category of evidence, sourced from disinterested professional observers working in real time rather than believers working from memory decades later, deserves to be weighted more heavily than almost anything else examined in this entire investigation, even though its connection to a reptilian genetic program specifically remains speculative rather than established. The fourth proof, the named military and intelligence witnesses, is the proof most improved by the deeper weighing this final part is built to provide, because its real strength was never simple volume of testimony, it was the specific verifiable cost each witness accepted by speaking. Cooper's naval service record, Stone's army service record, and the roster of credentialed participants at Greer's 2001 press conference are all independently confirmable as real people who held real positions, which is a meaningfully different category of evidence than anonymous or pseudonymous testimony, even before a single word of their specific claims is evaluated. What weakens this proof on close examination is not the witnesses' credibility as people, but the total absence, across every one of them, of a single piece of documentary or physical corroboration beyond their own spoken word. An absence made more significant rather than less by the fact that several of these witnesses explicitly claimed to have had access to physical material, retrieved craft components, classified catalogs, biological samples at the time of their claimed service, meaning the absence is not simply that no evidence exists, but that evidence these specific witnesses said existed under their own direct handling has never subsequently surfaced through any channel, including channels such as posthumous document releases and Freedom of Information Act requests that have successfully surfaced other genuinely classified material in unrelated fields over the same time period. The fifth proof, architectural and institutional symbolism, is the proof this final weighing treats most skeptically, and it deserves to be said plainly why. Nearly every specific claim in that proof has a complete, well-documented, non-conspiratorial explanation on its own terms. The caduceus insignia error, Bernini's own explicit written intent, the well-documented 19th century elite fascination with Egyptian revival architecture, Tanguma's own stated artistic intent, and the officially stated design rationale for the Denver Airport gargoyle. Where the earlier parts of this investigation treated these explanations as competing possibilities of roughly comparable weight, an honest final accounting has to acknowledge that they are not comparable in evidentiary strength at all. A primary source document, in an architect's or artist's own words, describing their own intent is direct evidence, while a modern viewer's alternative interpretation of the finished work, however striking, is inference layered on top of that direct evidence rather than a competing piece of evidence of equal standing. This does not mean the symbolic pattern observed across so many buildings is meaningless as cultural history. It means that its meaning is better explained as the visible trace of shared architectural and fraternal traditions moving through history, exactly as mainstream historians describe, than as evidence of an active, ongoing non-human influence over specific modern construction projects. The sixth proof, the abduction phenomenon, is the proof where the two explanations offered across this investigation are least mutually exclusive, and that fact alone makes it one of the more intellectually honest proofs to weigh. Sleep paralysis research explains a specific, definable, time-limited category of experience extremely well, and it does not require dismissing the sincerity of anyone reporting it to say so. What it explains less completely is the smaller category of multi-hour missing time cases with independent third-party corroboration of a discrepancy in elapsed time, since sleep paralysis, by clinical definition, resolves within minutes rather than hours. Loftus's hypnosis research presents a genuine and serious problem specifically for the detailed, elaborated content of recovered memories. The color of a room, the specific words spoken, the physical description of an entity without equally undermining a witness's more basic, non-hypnotically recovered claim that something disorienting and frightening happened to them at a specific time. A distinction the investigation's earlier treatment of this proof did not fully separate out, and that deserves to be separated out here. A memory can be sincere, emotionally real, and still have its specific, hypnotically elaborated details be unreliable, and both of those things can be true about the same witness at the same time without contradiction. The seventh proof, the Draco star origin claim, remains, on final weighing, the single strongest proof in this entire investigation for a reason that has nothing to do with testimony at all, and everything to do with the nature of the evidence itself. Every other proof in this investigation ultimately rests, at some point in its chain, on trusting a person, a witness's memory, a researcher's interpretation, an artist's intent, or its opposite. The Thuban alignment does not. It is a mathematical relationship between a fixed architectural structure and a calculable historical sky position, independently reproducible by anyone with the pyramid's coordinates, no different in kind from verifying a bridge's load-bearing calculations, and it does not require believing anyone's testimony at all, modern or ancient. What final weighing has to add, in fairness, is that this fact establishes only that ancient Egyptian religious architecture was deliberately aligned with that specific star, a genuinely remarkable and well-supported archaeoastronomical finding, and it establishes nothing whatsoever, on its own, about why that alignment was chosen, leaving mainstream Egyptology's explanation, tied to the circumpolar imperishable stars theology documented directly in the pyramid texts themselves, as a complete and sufficient account that requires no non-human visitor at all. The proof's real power in this investigation was never that it proves contact. It is that it demonstrates the ancient world's fixation on that specific point in the sky is not a modern invention retrofitted onto old material, which matters enormously for evaluating Part 1's mythology, but does considerably less work toward validating Part 7's modern contactee testimony layered on top of it. The eighth proof, the bloodline theory, is treated with the most caution in this final weighing, exactly as it was treated with the most caution when it was first presented, and that caution is itself the correct conclusion rather than a gap to be resolved. The Sumerian king list's opening line is genuine, verifiable, and says what this investigation reported it saying. What that fact can bear as evidentiary weight is limited to demonstrating that the concept of externally descended political authority is ancient and explicit rather than a modern conspiratorial gloss, and it cannot, on its own, verify any specific claim about any specific modern family or institution, a leap this investigation declined to make in Part 8 and continues to decline to make here, for the same reasons stated there. The ninth proof, photographic and video evidence, resolves the most cleanly of any proof examined in this investigation, and the resolution cuts sharply in the skeptical direction. The Santilli case demonstrated, through replicable forensic method rather than argument, that even elaborate, internationally broadcast footage can be conclusively identified as staged, and the same toolkit has done the same work on the majority of viral material in the years since. What survives that filtering, the Scape or Swamp vehicle damage, and the 1972 Loveland officers' report, survive specifically because they generated contemporaneous, disinterested institutional documentation, not because the photographic or physical evidence itself is strong, and that distinction, documentation of a report versus verification of its content, is worth being precise about rather than blurring together. The 10th proof, ordinary modern sightings, ends this recap closest to where the entire investigation began, a real and growing body of testimony, partially but not fully explained by reporting ease, inflation, and social contagion effects, resting on the same specific, narrow, repeated physical description that has now appeared in one form or another in every single proof this investigation has examined, from a Sumerian cylinder seal to a Utah cattle ranch under Pentagon-adjacent study. That specific repetition across 10 genuinely different categories of evidence gathered through 10 genuinely different methods by people with no reason to coordinate with one another across 5,000 years is the single fact this investigation keeps returning to, and it is worth stating clearly, one final time, exactly what that fact does and does not prove. It does not prove that reptilian beings exist. It proves that human beings, across an enormous span of time and an enormous range of methods for generating a belief, keep landing on the same specific story rather than on the wide, disorganized variety of different stories that pure independent invention or pure random misperception would be expected to produce. That specific observation deserves to be taken more seriously as a problem in its own right than this investigation has done up to this point, because it sits underneath every one of the 10 proofs simultaneously, and it is where the strongest version of the skeptical case actually lives, stronger than any individual rebuttal offered proof by proof. When 10 pieces of evidence appear to point in the same direction, the natural human instinct is to treat that convergence as 10 separate confirmations stacking on top of one another, each one making the underlying claim more likely than the last. That instinct is only justified if the 10 pieces of evidence are genuinely independent of one another, meaning each one would be equally likely to occur whether or not the underlying claim is true, arrived at through a separate causal pathway with no shared contamination between them. This investigation's own material, examined honestly, does not fully satisfy that condition, and saying so is not a concession to the skeptical side so much as it is simply accurate accounting. Cooper's 1991 testimony had already entered public circulation before Stone's formal testimony, before Ickey's synthesis, before the Skinwalker Ranch material became widely publicized, and before Good's public emergence, meaning every one of those later sources developed inside an information environment already shaped by the earlier one, whether or not any individual witness consciously drew on it. A citation network of that kind does not make later testimony false, but it does mean the later testimony cannot be counted as fully independent corroboration of the earlier testimony in the way a naive tally of separate witnesses would suggest, because a single influential source repeated and reinterpreted by a tightly connected community, no matter how many individual people eventually repeat it, remains closer to one data point than to 10. This same correlation problem applies with even more force to the mythological convergence examined in the first proof, and it deserves to be stated as directly as the philosophy of science demands. If Isbell's snake detection theory and Jung's archetype framework are correct, and there is substantial peer-reviewed support for both, then every human brain across every one of the 8 ancient civilizations examined in Part 1 was already running the same underlying cognitive software before a single myth was ever told. An elevated, evolved sensitivity to serpentine shape paired with a general tendency toward narrative elaboration of primal fears into structured social and political meaning. Under those conditions, cultural convergence on a serpent-based mythology of hidden power is not 10 independent confirmations of an external reality. It is one confirmation, repeated 10 times, of a single shared starting condition built into the human brain itself, no different in principle from how every unconnected culture on Earth also independently developed fire-based cooking, tool use, and some form of counting, not because those cultures secretly contacted one another or were taught by an external visitor, but because they were all working from the same starting material, the human brain and body encountering the same physical world. This is the central intellectual challenge this investigation has to leave you with honestly, rather than resolve for you falsely. The 10 proofs examined across this script are not 10 independent dice rolls that happen to land on the same number by extraordinary coincidence. They are, to varying degrees that differ proof by proof, a single underlying pattern, evolved fear, plus narrative elaboration, plus a 5,000-year head start on cultural transmission, plus, in the modern era, an interconnected and mutually reinforcing research and media community expressing itself across 10 different surfaces: myth, testimony, architecture, memory, astronomy, genealogy, film, and citizen report. Whether that single underlying pattern is itself downstream of a real ancient encounter, meaning the shared human fixation on serpentine hidden power originated from something real enough to imprint itself onto the evolving human psyche in the deep past, or whether it is fully and sufficiently explained by ordinary evolutionary psychology encountering an ordinary predator, is a question this investigation's own evidence cannot resolve, because both explanations predict, at this level of analysis, roughly the same outward pattern of human storytelling, and a theory that cannot be distinguished from its own null hypothesis by the available evidence is, by definition, not yet a settled question in either direction. It is worth applying one more established standard directly to this material before closing, because it is the standard most casual treatments of this subject skip entirely, and skipping it is where most bad conspiracy journalism goes wrong on both sides. The astronomer Carl Sagan popularized, though did not originate, the standard that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, a formulation with roots stretching back through the mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace's own writing on probability 2 centuries earlier. Applied rigorously, rather than as a slogan, the standard does not mean extraordinary claims should simply be dismissed. It means the strength of evidence required to accept a claim should scale with how much that claim would need to overturn about everything else we already know to be true. A claim that an unremarked species of large, technologically sophisticated terrestrial adjacent beings has coexisted with humanity for thousands of years, periodically interbred with it, and maintained continuous political influence across every major civilization in recorded history is, by any reasonable measure, among the more extraordinary claims a person could evaluate, because accepting it would require revising large, independently well-supported bodies of knowledge across genetics, paleontology, ecology, and the physical record of human archaeology, not merely adding one new fact to an otherwise unchanged picture of the world. Measured against that specific bar, the strongest individual pieces of evidence in this investigation, the Thuban alignment, the Sumerian king list, the Scape or Swamp insurance record, are genuinely extraordinary in the sense of being unusual, well-documented, and difficult to fully explain away, but none of them, individually or combined, rises to the level of extraordinary evidence in Sagan's specific sense, because none of them requires abandoning any existing, independently verified scientific understanding to accommodate. They require only additional interpretation layered on top of facts that remain true under either explanation. This is not a dismissal. It is a precise statement of exactly how much evidentiary work remains to be done before this theory could reasonably ask for wider acceptance. And precision, more than verdict, is what this investigation owes you at this point. It is worth pausing, briefly and seriously, on what would actually follow if some future piece of extraordinary evidence, a verified specimen, an authenticated document, a confirmed facility, finally arrived and the core claim examined across this investigation turned out to be true. The implications would not be contained to a single field. Theology across multiple major world religions would face a direct and difficult reckoning with creation narratives that, in several traditions examined in Part 1, already describe divine or semi-divine intervention in human origins, using imagery strikingly close to the material presented here, forcing a question many religious institutions have never had to seriously entertain. Whether an external, biological, technologically advanced actor and a divine one can be meaningfully distinguished at all once direct physical evidence enters the conversation. Genetics and evolutionary biology would face an even sharper challenge, since confirming any genuine hybridization event, ancient or ongoing, would require locating direct physical and genomic evidence within the human genome itself, a genuinely testable and falsifiable prediction that modern genomic sequencing technology is, unlike almost every other claim examined in this investigation, fully capable of resolving definitively rather than merely arguing about, and the fact that decades of large-scale human genome sequencing projects conducted for entirely unrelated medical and scientific purposes have not surfaced any confirmed non-terrestrial genetic signature is itself a quiet, easily overlooked, but genuinely relevant piece of evidence this investigation has not yet stated plainly until now. Geopolitically, confirmation of any of the underground facility or governmental awareness claims examined in Parts 3 and 4 would represent one of the largest sustained institutional secrets in human history, successfully maintained across multiple presidential administrations, multiple political parties, and multiple allied and adversarial intelligence services, with every incentive to expose one another's secrets. A level of coordinated, leak-proof discipline that has essentially no precedent in the verified history of large classified programs, nearly all of which, from the Manhattan Project to more recent surveillance programs, eventually surfaced through leaks, whistleblowers, or declassification within decades rather than remaining perfectly sealed across the better part of a century. And it is worth asking, with equal seriousness, the mirror question. If the core claim is not true, if every proof examined across this investigation ultimately traces back to the shared human psychology and cultural transmission described in Part 11, why has this specific theory persisted and in some respects grown for over 5,000 years and, in its modern form, for more than 3 decades of internet-era scrutiny that has debunked far weaker conspiracy claims within months of their appearance? Part of the answer lies in a documented and genuinely reasonable historical pattern that has nothing to do with reptilians at all. Governments have, in fact, repeatedly deceived their own populations about real programs, verified after the fact through declassification and formal investigation, including the CIA's MKUltra program, a real, congressionally investigated project involving covert psychological experimentation on unwitting American citizens, and the Public Health Service's Tuskegee syphilis study, a real, decades-long program in which researchers withheld treatment from Black American men without their informed consent in order to observe the disease's progression. Neither of these programs involved anything resembling non-human contact, but both are real, confirmed, and genuinely disturbing instances of exactly the kind of institutional deception this investigation's witnesses allege on a larger scale. And their existence means that a general, baseline public skepticism toward official denial is not, on its own, irrational or unreasonable, even though neither case provides any actual evidentiary support for this specific theory. A second part of the answer lies in a body of psychological research known as terror management theory, which proposes that human beings, uniquely aware of their own mortality among known species, are strongly motivated to embed themselves within larger meaning-making narratives that extend beyond an individual human lifespan, and a 5,000-year hidden history connecting ancient Sumer to a Utah ranch under Pentagon study offers exactly that kind of narrative scale, positioning an ordinary person's own life as a small but meaningful part of an ancient, continuing, and cosmically significant struggle, a genuinely powerful psychological reward entirely independent of whether the underlying claim is factually accurate. A third part of the answer is structural rather than psychological. The internet-era information ecosystem examined throughout this investigation, from viral iFlash clips to subscription-funded contactee platforms, rewards engagement and continued attention far more reliably than it rewards resolution. meaning a theory that could, in principle, be definitively settled by a single verified physical specimen, has instead spent 3 decades generating an ever-expanding, ever more detailed body of unresolved testimony, because unresolved mystery, not confirmed answer, is what sustains an audience across years rather than a single news cycle. None of this settles the matter, and it should not be mistaken for settling it. What it offers instead, and what this investigation hopes, is a more useful gift to you than a false verdict in either direction, is a working method for evaluating whatever comes next. Because more testimony, more footage, and more claimed whistleblowers will continue to surface in this field, regardless of what conclusion this particular script reaches tonight. Ask of any new claim whether the witness is named or anonymous, and if named, whether their claimed credentials are independently verifiable through any record outside the conspiracy research community itself. Ask whether the evidence offered is testimony, symbolism, or physical material, and weight physical material considerably more heavily than the other two, because physical material is the one category capable of being independently tested by a laboratory with no stake in the outcome. Ask who financially benefits from the claim's continued circulation, and treat that answer as relevant context rather than automatic disqualification, since sincere belief and financial benefit are not mutually exclusive, but the incentive is real and deserves to be weighed. Ask whether the claim could, even in principle, be proven false by some conceivable piece of evidence, and treat a claim that has been restructured to survive every prior disconfirmation, exactly as Popper's framework warns, with real and specific suspicion. And ask, finally, whether the new claim's core details match the narrow, specific, repeated pattern this investigation has traced across 5,000 years, or whether they represent yet another expansion of that pattern's already considerable elasticity, since a theory's capacity to comfortably absorb an unlimited number of new and increasingly elaborate additions is, on its own, a warning sign no amount of enthusiasm should be allowed to override. Somewhere above the northern hemisphere tonight, whether or not you ever look up to see it, Draco is still there, coiled across the pole the way it has been every clear night since long before the pyramids had a name, exactly where it was the night an Egyptian priest first aligned a shaft of solid limestone toward it, and exactly where it will be long after every witness examined in this investigation, named and anonymous alike, has died and been forgotten. The stories built around that patch of sky are not going anywhere, because the two things capable of producing them, a real ancient encounter this investigation cannot rule out, and an ordinary human mind fully capable of building an entire civilization's worth of meaning out of nothing more than a frightening shape and an unblinking, unmoving point of light, are both still exactly as present in the world as they have always been. This investigation set out to place the full weight of both possibilities in front of you, refusing the easier path of certainty in either direction, and that, after 5,000 years of testimony, symbol, and unresolved sky, is the only honest place it has left to end, not with an answer, but with the pattern laid out completely, finally, for you to weigh with your own eyes, exactly as every witness in this investigation, believer and skeptic alike, was ultimately left to do with theirs. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.